Chapter 269. I strongly recommend the Fox God's new book, Fate and Kyo. The book was published a week ago, but I was sick and in a daze, so I forgot about it. I was wrong. The book number is 222-6513. Speaking of which, Aunt Fox, no, the Fox God is dodgy, my sister. This book is really well written. Please support it. Older people were always worthy of respect. This old monk had sat on the mountain of bones and said that he was atoning for his sins for decades, so he was not an old man like Kuni Mati. Ning Kei put his bow behind him, but did not step forward. He looked at the skinny old monk from 100 feet away and said respectfully, "I am indeed a student of the academy. The front gate of the Devil's Doctrine opens in response to the heavens, but why do you say that all the bones on the ground are your sins?" The old monk gave a dry and weak laugh and said, "This is naturally a rather complicated story. Every time there was an adventure in the valley, one would hear a long and wonderful story when they met a strange person. Perhaps it was because he was expecting it. Ning Kei's reaction was very calm. He said softly, "Please enlighten me, senior." The old monk was silent for a moment and said leisurely, "When Madman Ke began to travel the world on behalf of the academy, he wore an ordinary cyan steel sword on his waist, and no one dared to go against him. At that time, the Devil's Doctrine was still strong, arrogant, and bloodthirsty. Many innocent people were killed by the Devil's Doctrine, so naturally there was a storm when the two met. That storm was extremely bloody. The powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine who ran amok in the Central Plains were all killed by Madman Ke's sword. The West Hill Divine Palace and the righteous also took this opportunity to eradicate the Devil's Doctrine. Madman Ke stood on the peak of the storm, pointing at the sky and the earth with no respect in his eyes. Naturally, the old fogies of the West Hill Divine Palace did not like him. The Devil's Doctrine was forced into a corner by that storm, so they came up with a plan. They wanted to use the estrangement between the Academy and the Divine Hall to set up a war between them. One year, during the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival in the Link Temple, cultivators from all the countries in the Central Plains gathered there. There were also dances, and the Devil's Doctrine massacred the front yard of the Link Temple. They blamed the disaster on the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall. That was the beginning of the story. The old monk was as skinny as a ghost. When he slowly talked about the bloody events of that year, his tone and expression were as gentle as the spring breeze. In just a few words, he omitted the cruel scenes of the past. Ning Kei helped Mo Shanshan to sit against the wall. He looked at the old monk of the White Bone Mountain and thought about the old story that he had told. After a moment of silence, he said, "Framing has always been classified as crude and clumsy." The old monk moved the corners of his drooping lips and smiled with difficulty. He looked at Ning Kei with a warm gaze and said with emotion, "The Devil's Doctrine in the outside world has probably been destroyed. Even if there are remnants, they are probably like rats crossing the street. So a child like you probably doesn't know what the Devil's Doctrine looked like in the past and what kind of terrifying power it possessed." It had been almost 2 years since Ning Kei left the city of Wei and began to come into contact with the world of cultivation. Other than the desolate man he had met a few days ago, he had only met a sword master who cultivated in the Devil's Doctrine at the entrance of the Northern Mountain Road. In his eyes, that sword master was not very powerful, so naturally, he did not think that the Devil's Doctrine was very scary. The old monk's withered eyes slowly drooped, as if recalling the arrogance of the Devil's Doctrine in the past was a kind of damage to his old and calm state of mind. Then he continued in a gentle voice, "The Devil's Doctrine's cultivation method is the art of stealing from the heavens. Those who cultivate in the Devil's Doctrine are healthy and have no psyche power, which is enough to avoid the prying eyes of cultivators. Back then, the people of the Devil's Doctrine used this advantage to infiltrate the countries in the Central Plains. Some of them became senior statesmen in the imperial court, and some of them became leaders of large clans in the countryside. Their power was as dense as a net. Even the imperial center administration of the Tang Empire and the West Hill Divine Palace had people from the Devil's Doctrine." The old monk slowly raised his head and looked at him calmly. He said, "If it wasn't for the fear of the Academy and the other unknown places, the Devil's Doctrine would have been able to change dynasties if they had gone all out. They didn't dare to act against heaven, but if they wanted to weave a conspiracy, how could they leave any loopholes? In fact, during the bloodbath in the Link Temple, the Devil's Doctrine endured the pain of losing an arm and exposed the Grand Master who had been hidden in the judicial department of the Divine Hall for decades. Then no one would doubt it. Ning Ke frowned and asked, "What does the bloodbath in the Link Temple have to do with the Academy and youngest uncle?" The old monk sighed. His sigh was full of pity. On the surface, the Devil's Doctrine bloodbath in the Link Temple during the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival was aimed at the cultivators of the righteous sects, but in fact, it was aimed at the envoys of the Tang Empire. However, the Devil's Doctrine wanted to provoke the madness of Crazy Ko, so their real target was the poor girls from the Tang Empire who only knew how to dance. Upon hearing this, Ning Ke's heart suddenly tightened. He knew from second brother that Mistress Jian and youngest uncle were old friends. At this moment, he naturally thought that these dancers were from the House of Red Sleeves. However, Mistress Jian was still alive and well. Occasionally, when she met him, she would pull his ear and lecture him, who had died in the past. Since the Devil's Doctrine had spared no expense to weave such a conspiracy, they naturally knew who they had to kill to make youngest uncle crazy enough to break into the Peach Mountain. It was just like if you returned to Lin 40th Street and suddenly saw Sang Sang lying in a pool of blood. All the evidence pointed to the Imperial Palace. Then, of course, he would not hesitate to break into the palace with a knife and arrow. He would break into the Imperial Study to tear the painting of Blooming on the Opposite Shore and then chop His Majesty into 365 pieces, but youngest uncle did not break into the Peach Mountain. Instead, he destroyed the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine with a single sword. Ning Ke looked at the skinny old monk in the Bone Mountain and asked in confusion, what went wrong with the Devil's Doctrine's arrangement? The old monk was silent for a long time. Then he laughed. His old and ugly smile hid a very complicated meaning. There were some emotions, some shock, some bitterness, and some pride. There was nothing wrong with the Devil's Doctrine's arrangement. At that time, the whole world thought that the judicial department of the Divine Hall had massacred the Link Temple. Although they could not understand it, when the Link Temple elder who lived in seclusion behind the Wa Mountain was forced to come out and said that the murderers were all from the West Hill, no one doubted it anymore. The old monk looked at him quietly and said, but Ko Howren did not believe it. Ning Ke was puzzled and asked, why didn't youngest uncle believe it? The old monk said, Crazy Ko is not so easy to fool. Ning Ke was startled and shook his head. He said, this reason is equivalent to no reason at all. The old monk sighed and said, back then, I once asked him the same question. Ning Ke listened carefully. The old monk smiled and said, at that time in this room, he said, how can I be so easy to fool? There was a moment of silence. And then, Ning Ke asked. He thought that every story should have a beginning and an end. The old monk was slightly surprised and asked, the story after that, does the world still not know? Ning Ke said, the storyteller is different, so the content of the story will also change. This story has a very simple ending. The old monk's voice became even weaker. He said, the Devil's Doctrine's methods could not fool Crazy Ko, so he naturally went to the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. At that time, the Devil's Doctrine Grandmaster thought highly of himself. There were many powerhouses in the Devil's Doctrine, but he was not too afraid. He thought that if you came, he would kill you. Crazy Ko naturally did not want to be killed by them, so he killed them all. He did not want to be killed by them, so he killed them all. It was a very simple narration, a very simple story, but it was a shocking past that had been buried in the dust of history. The simpler it was, the more shocking it was. After a few decades, only this old monk who was as skinny as a ghost and the countless skeletons that filled the main hall of the Devil's Doctrine could prove what had happened here in the past. Ning Ke looked at the old monk's sunken eyes and said, then why do you want to atone for your sins? What does this have to do with you? The old monk raised his thin arms. The monk's robe on his arms was ragged, and his fingers slightly spread to form a madra. The joints under the skin of his 10 fingers could be seen horribly, like a pair of skeletal hands reaching out from the underworld. However, the madra formed by the skeletal hands faintly released a warm aura that calmed one's heart. It was as compassionate as 2 white lotuses that had descended from Haotian. The aura between the skeletal hands and the white lotus madra was unusually strong and condensed, but it did not have the slightest lethality. As the aura was gradually released, a layer of extremely warm luster suddenly appeared on the surface of the skeletal bodies around the old monk, as if they were about to come to life. Ning Ke stared at the 2 pairs of skeletal hands in front of the old monk's abdomen. He felt the aura and was shocked speechless. The power that the old monk displayed was too profound and unpredictable. It was the most powerful state that he had ever seen in his life. Mo Shanshan sat leaning against the wall and looked at the white lotus madra formed by the old monk's skeletal hands. She suddenly thought of a sentence that her teacher had mentioned when she was young, and could not help but look surprised. In the West, there was a lotus that fell into the world. It had 32 petals, and each petal was different. Each petal was a world. Atonement. Naturally, it was because this sin was mine. Because there was never any conspiracy of the devil's doctrine. This conspiracy was also mine. I've known that the priest of the judicial department is from the devil's doctrine for many years. I also know what they want to do, but I didn't do anything. I sat on the cold black chair, holding my chin, and quietly watched them do this. Then I was ready to find the right time to tell Koharan. However, I still underestimated Koharan. He did not need me to take out the evidence that I had carefully preserved. He knew that this was done by the devil's doctrine. This was good. So, I still sat quietly on the black and cold chair, holding my chin, and quietly waited for the arrival of the last moment. The old monk, who was as skinny as a ghost, sat among the piles of corpses. His skeletal hands formed the white lotus madra, and his eyes were gentle and compassionate. Ning Ke widened his eyes and asked in a trembling voice, "Who are you? What did you want to do back then?" This was the second time the old monk had heard this question. He slowly raised his head and looked at the sky. The iron chain that passed through his abdomen moved and made a crisp sound. The pain returned to his skinny face. The old monk looked at the sky. His deep-set eyes were still warm. The white lotus petals formed by his skeletal hands bloomed. Back then, I wanted to destroy the devil's doctrine. I wanted Koharan to die. However, I did not expect that he would still be alive after I spent half of my life and effort to turn the entire devil's doctrine into a monstrous storm. As for who I am, the old monk retracted his gaze and looked at the 2 of them. He said gently, "I am the priest of judgment." Divine Lord Lotus? An incredulous voice suddenly sounded from the back of the room. The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, who was dressed in rags, had arrived. She looked at the madra formed by the skinny monk in the middle of the mountain of bones. Her face was filled with disbelief and fanatical joy. Mo Shanshan almost shouted at the same time, "Master Lotus?" To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 270. Yi Hongyu suddenly appeared in the main hall of the Devil's Doctrine. Her left shoulder was covered with coagulated blood beads. Her red dress was torn and could not cover her body. She looked extremely embarrassed, but her eyes were still shockingly bright. Ning Ke did not know that she had relied on the qi in her chest to break all the stones in front of her and come to this place with great difficulty. However, he could guess what kind of hardships she had gone through just by looking at her. He could not help but admire her a little. Compared with the faint admiration, he was more nervous to see the Tao addict here. His right hand quickly reached behind him and held the hilt. He was ready to take advantage of the Tao addict's weakness to kill this terrifying enemy. However, he found that Yi Hongyu did not pay attention to him at all. Mo Shanshan, who was leaning against the wall, did not pay attention to him. The Tao addict and the calligraphy addict looked at the skinny monk in the Bone Mountain, intoxicated and speechless. To the east of the West Hill Divine Kingdom, there was a large round stone pillar near the sea. It was used to resist the dangerous waves on the sea. Behind the stone pillar was the Kingdom of Song. Perhaps because it was used to the rain and wind on the sea, this inconspicuous small country had contributed many great people to the world. Many priests in the divine hall came from the Kingdom of Song. The great divine priest of light, who had been imprisoned for many years, also came from the Kingdom of Song. One night many years ago, a water lily bloomed in the backyard of an aristocratic family mansion in the capital of the Kingdom of Song. Along with the lotus, a baby boy was born. So the baby boy was named Liansheng. The young master of an aristocratic family, Liansheng, was not too amazing in his youth. Like the other young masters around him, he studied and took exams. Then he was awarded an official position and married a wife. However, his wife died of illness before he had a child. After his wife passed away, Liansheng built a grass hut near the grave. He was sad and withered, and did not show his happiness for 3 months. One night, it was raining heavily outside the grass hut. Liansheng walked into the wind and rain and meditated for half a night. He came back in wet clothes and wrote a morning essay for his wife. Then he threw the brush into the new grass in front of the grave and floated away with a laugh. In the following years, Liansheng visited the mountains and many cultivation sections. At that time, the essay for his wife was spread to the world and caused many people to cry. He was already famous and all the sects treated him with respect, but they were not willing to talk to him about cultivation. In the autumn of the second year, Liansheng swam to the Hua mountain and took shelter in the Leng temple when it rained. That night, when he was lying quietly in the back hall, he happened to hear an old monk talking about Buddhism. After thinking about it for a day and a night, he walked back to the main door of the Leng temple and rang the bell. He pushed the door open and entered the room. He told the reception monk that he wanted to debate with the abbot of the Leng temple. The debate lasted for 32 days. Liansheng's eloquent words were like a lotus blooming in the clouds of Tile Mountain. During the conversation, there were faint cries of divine birds among the trees by the cliff, attracting the attention of countless famous scholars. The debate at the Leng temple became another grand event after the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival. The name of Master Lotus began to spread in the world. On the last day, the former Haotian hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace came from Peach Mountain and invited Lotus as a visiting professor in front of thousands of people. Unexpectedly, Liansheng smiled and declined. Then, he stroked his head in front of the elder of the Leng temple in Tile Mountain. His black hair fell like a black lotus, and his Buddhist heart became firmer. When the leaves fell in autumn, Liansheng left the Leng temple in Tile Mountain. He crossed the river to the Ink Lake, went through the wild forest, and entered the Yueluan kingdom. Then, he disappeared in the vast wilderness in the northwest of the Yueluan kingdom. No one knew where he went. A few years later, a monk returned from the wilderness. He walked around the palace and talked about karma and lucky chance with the nobles and commoners in the streets. He was well-versed in Buddhism and had a good character. He was respected by the world. There was no Master Lotus in the world, but there was Master Lotus. At that time, the devil's doctrine was very powerful. It was hard to stop their infiltration of the countries in the Central Plains. Among them, there were 2 elders of the devil's doctrine who were the most mysterious. They secretly provoked the relationship between the sects of the countries and caused many bloody disasters. However, no one knew where the 2 elders of the devil's doctrine were hiding. That spring, Master Lotus was invited by the Haotian hierarch of West Hill to teach at the Divine Hall. During the banquet, the vice headmaster of the Revelation Institute spoke with contempt and dissatisfaction. Master Lotus strolled to the vice headmaster's seat in front of the hierarch lord and many powerhouses of the Divine Hall. Then he killed him. The vice headmaster of the Revelation Institute was one of the 2 elders of the devil's doctrine. The hierarch of Haotian Taoism invited Master Lotus to the Divine Hall again. This time he was not a foreign minister. Instead, he invited him to take up the position of the great divine priest of judgment that had been vacant for many years. Master Lotus said that it was not time yet and declined again. Master Lotus left the Peach Mountain and went to the Tile Mountain. He had been enlightened in the Tile Mountain. Now that he had returned from the outside world, he stayed in the Lank Temple to cultivate. He did not receive any visitors for 2 years and was gradually forgotten by the world. One day, a high-ranking sweeping monk in the Lank Temple suddenly died. The entire temple was shocked. Master Lotus walked out of the room and admitted that he had killed the sweeping monk. The sweeping monk was another elder of the Devil's Doctrine hidden in the Central Plains. Master Lotus lived in seclusion in the Tile Mountain for 2 years in order to investigate this matter. At that point, the 2 most mysterious elders of the Devil's Doctrine hidden in the Central Plains, Wind and Cloud, were both dead. Many of the Devil's Doctrine's evil and bloody plans were exposed. Master Lotus' name was known throughout the world. The White Tower Temple of the Ueluan Kingdom and the Link Temple of the Tile Mountain remembered his kindness and honored him as the protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect. The West Hill Divine Palace rewarded him and invited him to read the 6 tomes of Arcane. Then, he was conferred the title of the Great Divine Priest of Judgment. Master Lotus became the first disciple of the Buddhism sect in history to become the Great Divine Priest of the West Hill Divine Palace. A few years later, the Grand Master of the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall was involved in the murder at the Link Temple. Master Lotus was saddened by the death of his old friend and was willing to take responsibility. He refused to stay on the Peach Mountain and refused to be the Great Divine Priest. He left and went into seclusion. From then on, there was no Master Lotus in the world of cultivation. However, Master Lotus' name was still being passed down in this world until now. In the memories of the current world, Master Lotus was always shrouded in a layer of benevolence and mysteriousness. The benevolence was because of his actions, and the mysteriousness was because his dazzling life was too legendary. Master Lotus was good at writing and calligraphy. He studied the world and read old books quietly. There was no hindrance in his cultivation. He understood Tao in the Lank Temple and entered the knowing destiny state in a few years. His Dharma was profound and his Haotian Taoism cultivation method was equally profound. He was a great writer and calligrapher, a protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect and the great divine priest of judgment of the Divine Hall. Such a person who was willing to get close to all the beauty in the world, had the ability to understand all the laws in the world, and was brave enough to take on all the things in the world. He did it so perfectly. No one knew if he would appear again in the future. In many people's eyes, such a perfect person could not be acquired through cultivation. He could only be born with it. That was why the later generations left such an evaluation of him, who had disappeared without a trace. There was a lotus in the west that fell into the world. It had 32 petals. Each petal was different, and each petal was a world. His Buddhist name was Lianxing 32. He was like a white lotus that had drifted down to the mortal world. Every single lotus petal that bloomed like jade revealed a great ability, and it brought a trace of comfort to this ugly and filthy world. Ning Ke knelt down and kowtowed to the mossy sword mark on the stone in the Great Blockage Formation outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. It was because he was kowtowing to his elder, the closeness in his blood, the admiration and yearning in his spirit. To the Tao addict and Mo Shanshan, Master Lotus was also a mountain that had been in their consciousness since the beginning of cultivation. Their blood flowed naturally with closeness and admiration. That was why they did not care about what Ning Ke was thinking at this moment. They did not have any desire to fight. They knelt down and kowtowed to the skinny old monk with great respect. Compared to the calligraphy addict, the Tao addict was obviously more excited. She was the Grand Master of the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall, and Master Lotus had once been the Great Divine Priest of Judgment of the Divine Hall. That meant that Master Lotus was like her Grand Master. More importantly, although the Judicial Department was the most powerful place in the West Hill Divine Palace, it had a bad reputation because of the prisoners. In the eyes of the world, it was always more gloomy than holy. For hundreds of years, only when the Divine Lord Lotus was in power could the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall suppress the evils of the Devil's Doctrine and gain the respect of the people. The elders in the judicial department could not forget the good times in the past. Therefore, in the eyes of the people in the judicial department, Divine Lord Lotus had a special status. She could not suppress the shock and excitement in her heart. Looking at the lotus handprint on the old monk's abdomen, she said with a trembling voice, "I am Yi Hongyu, the priest of the judicial department of the Divine Hall. Greetings, Divine Lord Lotus." Everyone in the Peach Mountain thought that Divine Lord Lotus had achieved great success in cultivation and had gone to serve Haotian. I did not expect that I would have the good fortune to meet the Divine Lord Lotus. Master Lotus did not expect to see a newcomer from the judicial department here. After a slight pause, he gently sighed and said, "I have said that time is unknown in the mountains. Now it seems that it is true. A clean and lovely girl like you has been dragged into the muddy water. What a pity." If it was anyone else who described the judicial department as a muddy water, Yi Hongyu would definitely make that person suffer a fate worse than death. However, at this moment, she did not have any reaction. This was because the one who said this was the ancestor of the judicial department. She did not dare to disobey him. More importantly, Divine Lord Lotus's voice was so gentle and kind, as if he was a grandfather who loved his little granddaughter. It made her feel warm and shy, which was rarely seen. The voices of the three addicts shook the world. Now, the Tao addict and the calligraphy addict were kneeling in front of the bone mountain like obedient children. Only Ning Ke was still standing straight. Mo Shanshan secretly pulled him a few times, but he pretended not to see it. Ning Ke was not like the calligraphy addict and the Tao addict who had studied insects since young and knew so many legends of the cultivation world. He had only entered the cultivation world with great difficulty 2 years ago. His senior brothers and sisters at the back of the mountain of the academy were not interested in telling stories. Therefore, his knowledge was too limited. He had never even heard of the name Lotus 32. Therefore, he naturally could not kneel in reverence like Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu. Hearing the 4 words, Divine Lord Lotus, he looked at the old monk sitting in the pile of bones and laughed. He said, "So you were once the great divine priest of judgment of the Divine Hall. No wonder you wanted to destroy the devil's doctrine." His smile gradually faded. He stared at the old monk's face and said, "But I still don't understand. Why did you spend half of your life to create such a plot to harm my youngest uncle? If it were me, I would not do this even if I had eaten too much." There was actually someone in this world who dared to use such a disrespectful tone to question the Divine Lord Lotus. Yi Hongyu, who was kneeling in front of the bone mountain, turned around and looked at Ning Ke coldly. Her eyebrows were slightly raised and as sharp as swords. "Recently, I can only write slowly like this. My face is full of sweat. However, on Monday, no matter what, I have to shout with all my might, 'Recommendation vote.' Hurry up and vote. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 271. The old monk looked at Ning Ke warmly and said with a smile, "You don't seem to have heard of me." Ning Ke was slightly stunned and said, "Everyone should have heard of you." The old monk squeezed out a self-deprecating smile with difficulty on his face that was as skinny as a ghost. He said, "It may sound a little ridiculous, but I think that only a few decades have passed. The people of the younger generation should still remember my name." Ning Ke did not know what to say. He looked at Yi Hongyu's cold gaze and Mo Shanshan's helplessness. He thought to himself, could it be that Divine Lord Lotus was telling the truth? If you know my story, you should know that I comprehended Tao in Leng Temple and served the chief monk of Xiankong Temple in preaching. I passed by the Divine Hall twice, but did not enter. But in the end, I still became the great divine priest of judgment. However, I think you 2 girls would not know that I almost became the great priest of the devil's doctrine." The old monk looked gently at the 3 young people who could not hide their shock. He said slowly, "Since the devil's doctrine could infiltrate the countries of the Central Plains, the Buddhist sects of the Central Plains must have done something similar. Don't be too surprised. Looking back at my life, I have experienced too many things. Sometimes when I think about it in the middle of the night, I find it exciting. But if I think about it carefully, the proudest thing in my life is to have a friend like Kauran. You ask me why I want Kauran to die. The old monk looked at Ning Ke with a compassionate but slightly bitter expression. Because he is my best friend. I know his earth-shattering abilities better than anyone else. When I was young, I accompanied him in the mountains for a few years. When I met him again, I was shocked to find that his abilities were getting stronger, and he was getting closer to the darkness of the night. There are many kinds of friends, but I want to be a good friend. The more capable Kauran is, the more I can't accept the change in his view of the world. That's why I'm going to drag him into this bloody storm at all costs, even if it will hinder my life's wishes. I'd rather he die with the devil's doctrine than fall into the devil's path. The room fell into a dead silence as they listened to the distant but still soul-stirring past. Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan lowered their heads subconsciously. The young talisman master had vaguely heard about it from her teacher. The Tao addict had lived in the West Hill Divine Palace for a long time, so she knew Mr. Ke's story better than most people in the world. Ning Ke had never heard of it. Through the indirect narration of his senior brothers and sisters in the back mountain, youngest uncle's image was always so lofty and proud, holding a cyan steel sword in his hand and swearing at the heavens and the earth, invincible in the world. How could he relate it to the image of the devil's doctrine? He raised his eyebrows, looked at Master Lotus and asked, "How did my youngest uncle join the devils?" The old monk sighed and said, "The devil comes from the heart. Anyone can become a devil." Ning Ke was not a typical Tang, but he still retained a lot of Tang's bearing in his bones. He did not believe this at all. He shook his head and said calmly and affirmatively, "My youngest uncle is invincible in the world. He is the most powerful in both strength and spirit. He does not need external help, so why would he cultivate the devil's doctrine?" The old monk said with a gentle expression, "He has never cultivated the devil's doctrine. Just as you said, he does not need the help of the devil's doctrine. But you do not know that a person like Kauran is like the great divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. He will not be confused by external factors, but he will go astray because of his own thoughts. When his view of the world changes, he will start to turn his back on the glory of Haotian and walk towards the dark side." Ning Ke was stunned and said, "I don't understand." Hearing this honest or stupid answer, the old monk laughed and shook his head very slowly. Then, he gradually stopped laughing and looked at Ning Ke calmly and said, "Anyway, when he picked up that sword, he had already become a devil." Ning Ke asked, "Kauran's sword?" The old monk agreed. Ning Ke thought of the book, a preliminary exploration of Kauran's sword that he read in the old library and the sword-riding skill that second brother taught him in the back mountain of the academy. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, "Kauran's sword has nothing to do with the devil's doctrine." The old monk looked at him and said with a smile, "People only know about the Kauran sword, but not the Great Spirit. If you have the opportunity to understand what the Great Spirit is in the future, you will probably understand why I said that." Ning Ke vaguely understood something. It was probably because youngest uncle's state was too strong in the past. In order to achieve a breakthrough or in philosophy, he created the Great Spirit, just like the great divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. However, the Great Spirit was something that Haotian did not allow to exist, just like the devil's doctrine. I still don't understand. Ning Ke looked at the old monk in the White Bone Mountain and said with a smile, "Anyway, I do not believe that youngest uncle will become a devil." This was unreasonable. Anyway, whether it was the Tangs or the Academy, they were best at being unreasonable. He thought to himself, after all, this is the past from decades ago. Even if you are the divine Lord Lotus, what can you do to me? Mr. Ke did become a devil later on, Yi Hongyu suddenly said. She turned back to look at Ning Ke and said, "In the end, he was punished by heaven and died." Ning Ke was stunned. Then, he jumped up like a wild cat whose tail had been stepped on. He scolded loudly, "Punish your mother." Hearing such vulgar words, Yi Hongyu strangely did not retaliate in anger. Instead, She looked at him with a complicated expression. After a moment of silence, she said, "I respect Mr. Ko and will spare your life for now." Looking at her reaction, Ning Kei suddenly understood that she was telling the truth. In the back of the mountain of the academy, second brother had said that youngest uncle had died, but he did not say how he died. Regardless of whether it was Master Yensei or other cultivators, no one had ever mentioned that there was a youngest uncle in the academy. It turned out that youngest uncle had used such a method to leave this world. Youngest uncle was second brother's idol. Second brother was Ning Kei's idol. Hence, youngest uncle was his biggest idol. It was a pity that he had only heard a few words in the wind. Hence, he did not have a clear image of youngest uncle. He could only vaguely feel proud from afar. Now that he had come to the wilderness and felt the proud and confident aura in the vast Tianqi Mountains, youngest uncle became alive in his spiritual world. He followed the aura and passed through the mountains into the verdant valley. He broke through the realm and comprehended Tao by the lake. He confidently and firmly stepped over the stone array tactics and arrived at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Here, he had finally heard youngest uncle's story and guessed the ending of the story. While he was shocked and sad, he suddenly realized that this was the natural course of the story. For a proud and confident person like youngest uncle, when there was nothing in the world that was worthy of his attention, he would naturally pull out the sword at his waist and point it at the sky above his head. However, could humans still not defeat heaven? Ning Kei stood silently in the mountain of bones and did not know what to say. The old monk sat quietly in the mountain of bones. From the moment he heard that Ko Hauran had joined the devil and was punished by heaven, he fell into absolute silence, just like how he had been for the past decades. A merciful light of Buddha appeared on his skinny, skeletal face. In the end, he still died like this. The old monk lowered his head and sighed. It was hard to tell whether it was a sigh of praise or sorrow. As he sighed, his body that was as skinny as a skeleton suddenly relaxed. Dust splashed out from the cracks of his bones or his tattered monk robe. After the dusty stories were told, it was time to talk about the love and hatred in the present world. Everything in the world was always repeating in such a boring cycle. Yi Hongyu's bare legs tightened slightly, and her right hand held onto the Taoist sword at her waist. Ning Kei suddenly woke up. He looked at her back and frowned slightly. He quickly said, "Master Lotus is in such a situation. Are you in a hurry to take action now? In my opinion, it is better to save him first." The old monk slowly raised his head and looked at the young man calmly and mercifully. He smiled and said, "I am a person who has bound myself. If I don't want to come out, who can help me?" Yi Hongyu knew that Ning Kei was trying to stall for time. She remained silent and held onto the hilt of her sword tightly. Just as she was about to turn around, she suddenly saw Divine Lord Lotus looking at her and shaking his head. She could not help but feel a chill in her heart and stopped what she was doing. The old monk smiled and said, "I have been hiding here for decades to atone for my sins. I have never left the outside world to fight and kill. Why must you children let me see all this? There are only bones in front of me. Why kill again?" Yi Hongyu did not understand. Legend had it that when Divine Lord Lotus was still a Vedanta of the Buddhism sect, he had killed people in front of the Divine Hall's hierarch and other powerhouses. Occasionally, he would turn into a thunderous rage. How could he be such a kind and withered monk? However, looking at Divine Lord Lotus's deep eyes that were filled with kindness, warmth, and peace, even though she was mentally strong, she could not help but feel her body and mind relax. She could no longer have any competitive spirit, and her right hand slowly let go of the sword hilt. The old monk said gently, "I never thought that the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine would open one day. Since you are able to enter the front gate at such a young age, you must be the most outstanding young people in the world. It is indeed a form of torture for young people like you to listen to these boring old stories. However, thinking that you are the future of the cultivation world, I really hope that you can control your temper and continue listening to this story." Upon hearing this, Yi Hongyu did not think much. She bowed and sat back on the ground. Emo Shanshan had been sitting quietly on the ground with her legs crossed. As long as Ning Ke did not have to risk his life against the Tao addict, he would not have any objections even if he was asked to tell the story for 3 days and 3 nights. Therefore, he said sincerely, "Master, please enlighten me." Yi Hongyu frowned slightly. She hated this person's shamelessness. Everyone in the world thought that the judicial department of the Divine Hall had done the murder in the Link Temple. Only I and a few people in the Divine Hall knew that it was done by the Devil's Doctrine. When we were about to find the right time to tell Kaharan, he had already seen through the truth. Of course, it was only the first layer of the truth. To be honest, I still do not know how he saw through it. That day, I saw him riding a donkey to the Daming Lake. I saw him disperse the lake water with a wave of his hand. I saw him cut through the stone array tactics with his sword. I was very comforted because I thought that my plan was about to succeed. The old monk paused for a long time before continuing softly. That was because I thought that no matter if he destroyed the Devil's Doctrine or was killed by the Devil's Doctrine, he would never have the chance to join the devil again. I had done my duty as a friend. Ning Ke thought that youngest uncle must have had 8 lifetimes of bad luck to have a friend like you. The old monk said with endless regret and pain. However, I have never seen anyone kill people like that in my life. Recently, it is a juncture of the night. Once we cross it, everything will be flat. Moreover, because of my old waist, I can only write slowly and seriously like this. However, I still need everyone to vote for me. Thank you very much. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.
Come to vote for me.
Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 272. The old monk sighed and said, "That autumn, when I was debating on Hua Mountain, the hierarch came to see me. Another autumn, I left the central plains for the wilderness. People thought that I was living in seclusion in the Link Temple, but that was not the case. During that period, I was invited by the Divine Hall to cultivate in the Devil's Doctrine. That was the reverse infiltration of the Central Plains." Hearing this, Ning Ke was slightly shocked. He wondered if this old monk had almost become the leader of the Devil's Doctrine. It was a good plan for the West Hill Divine Palace to invite him, Lotus 30, to infiltrate the Devil's Doctrine. This person was trusted by the Devil's Doctrine and even climbed to a high position. He must be one of the best in the world in terms of state, means, and will. The old monk did not know what Ning Ke was thinking. He looked at the dusty stone walls in the room with a gentle expression, as if he was looking at the clean main hall of the Devil's Doctrine decades ago. He continued slowly, "In the world's impression, the Devil's Doctrine is full of evil and damned scum. The truth is not far from it. Those in the Devil's Doctrine kill innocents, kidnap children, and force them to cultivate devil skill. Countless people die every year. But is the Devil's Doctrine a piece of iron?" When the Devil's Doctrine was at its peak, it was divided into 7 schools and 28 schools. Each school had different cultivation ideas, and even the idea of entering the human world. Some schools were like Buddhist monks who did not interact with the human world. How could they do evil? The old monk retracted his gaze and looked at the 3 of them calmly. He said, "The Devil's Doctrine is like any other sect. There are good and bad people. I admit that most of them are bad people, but there are always good people. However, when the sword broke the stone array tactics and killed its way into the front gate, who knows if those who died were good or bad? When Kuaharan killed his way into the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, I was in this mountain." The old monk lowered his head slowly. His neck made a dry sound as if it would fall at any time. He said, "I lived in the Devil's Doctrine for many years and naturally had many old acquaintances. I knew that some were greedy, some spoiled their concubines, and some loved to be their children's horses. On that day, everyone I knew died. I infiltrated the Devil Sect with the goal of destroying the Devil Sect. Those people died in front of me one by one. I should be happy, but I don't know why, but I just can't feel happy." Looking at those familiar faces being sliced in half, the children who used to jump on my knees being sliced in half, the blood spreading out of the temple, dyeing the lower half of the wordless monument red, flowing down the stone steps, and finally dripping slowly into the pitch-black abyss along the stone beams that you should have seen. I suddenly realized that I was very sad. Ning Ke frowned slightly and said, "Enough." The old monk looked at him mercifully and shook his head slowly, saying, "This is not your youngest uncle's killing karma. I am recalling those scenes not to blame him. I just want to understand, what exactly is a demon? Is the devil's doctrine, which slaughters the innocent, the devil? Or is the murderous Ko-Hauran the devil? Because I was worried that Ko-Hauran would become a demon and cause him to kill so many people. Would that make him become a demon instead? Or could it be that I, the one who secretly arranged everything behind the scenes, was the real demon?" Looking at the blood on the ground, I began to ask myself some questions. The old monk's voice gradually became doubtful. This kind of doubt was the doubt of standing on the Peach Mountain and looking at the sky. It was the doubt of standing in the ruins and feeling the vicissitudes of history. It was the doubt of oneself and this world. How should we differentiate the right path and the devil path? What exactly is a demon? If we are to differentiate based on ideology and morality, then the devil's doctrine is a demon who slaughters the innocent. Then who doesn't kill in the long road of cultivation? The Buddhism sect says that all living beings are equal. If we are to become a demon by killing people, then what about butchers who kill pigs? When we were young, we picked up stones to kill stray dogs on the road. When we gnawed on pigs' trotters until our hands were covered in grease and we tore off the strong tendons with relish, did we ever think that this was the flesh of a pig? Did we become a demon when we were doing these things? If we are to differentiate based on birth, the devil's doctrine originated from the great divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. According to historical records, the great divine priest of light was virtuous, compassionate, and brilliant. How could he be innately evil? The devil's doctrine originated from the Ming hand scroll of the 7 tomes of arcane of Haotian Taoism. It was originally a branch of Haotian Taoism, so why did it become a demon? The old monk looked at the 3 young people in front of him quietly and said softly, "The front gate of the devil's doctrine has been destroyed, and blood flows like a river." After that day, I have been trapped here to atone for my sins for decades. I have been thinking about this question for decades. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan were silent as they pondered over the words of the previous generation's eminent monk. Yi Hongyu suddenly raised her head and said without hesitation, "Divine Lord Lotus, you are wrong. The reason why the devil's doctrine became a demon has nothing to do with ideology and morality, nor does it have anything to do with one's birth. It is because the cultivation method itself is an evil one. Haotian sent divine light to the world, bestowing warmth and light. Only then can all living things in the world grow, and only then can there be a flow of aura between heaven and earth. However, the cultivation method of the evildoers of the devil's doctrine forcefully snatched the chi of vitality from nature and recklessly absorbed the heaven and earth into their bodies. It is equivalent to stealing the light of heaven's benevolence. If these evildoers are allowed to grow stronger, the aura of heaven and earth will gradually dry up, and the world will be destroyed. What then? This kind of cultivation method blasphemes Haotian and overturns the heaven and earth. It is a great disrespect, and that is why it became a demon." The young girl's voice was exceptionally firm and clear at this moment. This matter involved the difference between Taoism and the devil. Even when facing the divine Lord Lotus, whom she respected and admired, she remained calm and unyielding. She said in a low voice, "The difference between Taoism and the devil is not in ideology or bloodline, but in the difference between survival and destruction of the world. It is like black and white, light and darkness. How can they be compatible? Divine Lord, you are wrong." Yi Hongyu's crisp voice helped Mo Shanshan to dispel the doubts in her heart. She nodded slightly and thought that what she said was true. The difference between Taoism and the devil was whether one had good or evil intentions towards the world. In the past, Ning Ke did not understand why the cultivators of the West Hill Divine Palace, the Buddhism sect, and the Tang Empire would treat the devil's doctrine as enemies when it was mentioned. It was so resolute that it made one's heart palpitate. Today, Yi Hongyu's words finally made him understand the reason behind it. The Devil's Doctrine's cultivation method absorbed the qi of heaven and earth for one's own use. The higher one's state, the more qi of heaven and earth one could absorb. If the Devil's Doctrine was allowed to develop in the world until everyone started cultivating the Devil's Doctrine, the entire world's qi of heaven and earth would be sucked dry. By then, the world would be destroyed. It was like a flock of sheep on the grassland. If they ate all the grass on the grassland would become a desert and the sheep would naturally die. He finally realized that the reason why the Devil's Doctrine was viewed as an enemy by the world was because of an environmental problem. The Tao addict, the calligraphy addict, and the flower addict were the three addicts in the world. If they were in another environment that Ning Ke was familiar with, they would be those intelligent girls who studied both arts and sciences and shamelessly studied until 3 o'clock every night. These girls were usually stubborn and crazy. They loved to say things like, "I love my teacher, but I love the truth more." The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, was like all the cultivators in the world like Ning Quebec. She had once doubted the difference between the world and the Devil's Doctrine. She had thought about it and even reflected on it. However, she was different from other cultivators. She was not limited by the world's fixed views and gradually stopped thinking about these problems. She did not let her hatred towards the devil become a part of her instincts. Instead, she constantly increased her understanding of the world and learned from it. She finally came up with her own views. This kind of thinking was 1,000 times more resolute than the beliefs of those ordinary cultivators. That was why, even though she was extremely respectful towards the Divine Lord Lotus, she still insisted on her own views and refused to bow down. That was because she believed that this was the truth. Her views were neither hypocritical nor pretentious. She did not talk about lucky chance, karma, or killing. She only talked about benefits and benefits. She talked about whether the Devil's Doctrine and the Taoism doctrine would bring benefits or harm to the world. Because it was simple, it was certain, and it was extremely difficult to refute. However, Master Lotus was, after all, Master Lotus. He only used a simple sentence to make Yi Hongyu's seemingly unbreakable point of view relax and waver. This was because Master Lotus was more knowledgeable and had spent more time to study and reflect. Furthermore, Yi Hongyu's point of view was not tied tightly enough. I have said before that I once lived in the Devil's Doctrine for a period of time. I did not find the Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane, but I came into contact with many skills of the Devil's Doctrine. I believe that no one in this world has a deeper understanding of the Devil's Doctrine than me. The old monk looked at Yi Hongyu with a gentle expression and said, "I had the same thoughts as you in the past. However, after I saw the cultivation of the people in the Devil's Doctrine, saw their birth and death, and saw their relationship with heaven and earth, my thoughts gradually changed. That was because I was the same as you now. We have both forgotten a very important problem. The people in the Devil's Doctrine have strong bodies and long lives, but they will still die in the end. When they die, the qi of heaven and earth that they have cultivated for decades or even hundreds of years will return to heaven and earth as their bodies stiffen and die." After a moment of silence, the old monk smiled and said, "Once you understand this, you will understand that the Devil's Doctrine does not want to build another world. Instead, they want to open up a space that belongs to them. That space could be a lake, a mountain, or a beautiful grassland. However, no matter which it is, this space will eventually become a part of heaven and earth. Both of us were born in this world and grew up bathed in the divine light of Haotian. We cultivated and breathed. In the end, our bodies turned into ashes and our aura dissipated. Both of us returned to the embrace of Haotian. Perhaps our paths are different, but our starting and ending points are the same. Then, can you tell me, what is the difference between the Devil's Doctrine, Taoism sect, and Buddhism sect?" Yi Hongyu was slightly stunned and could not answer. She felt that there was something wrong with Divine Lord Lotus's words. However, she could not pinpoint the problem in such a short period of time. The old monk looked at her and said calmly, "I know what you're thinking. The people in the Devil's Doctrine will die. Then, They will not cause any harm to this balanced and great world. If they can live forever after joining the devil's doctrine, then Taoism, or should I say, your vigilance and enmity will be valid. However, when has there ever been an immortal in this world? Yi Hongyu slowly sat on her lap. Her black hair flowed down from her shoulders, and she looked a little lonely. These words had a huge impact on her Taoist heart. Usually, if she heard someone saying that Taoism and the devil's path had the same goal, she would definitely laugh coldly and draw her sword to kill them. However, the person who said these words today was the divine Lord Lotus, whom she respected. More importantly, there was nothing wrong with divine Lord Lotus's words. The old monk seemed to be able to sense her uneasiness and faint fear. He looked at her with a compassionate gaze and sighed softly. Then, he raised his right hand with difficulty and stretched it towards the sky. His fingers shone brightly. Yi Hongyu looked over in shock. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan looked over in confusion. The three of them could feel the holy aura released from the old monk's skinny fingers at the same time. In order to atone for my sins, I set up the confinement in this room. This confinement is the world outside of my body. The chi of heaven and earth here is thin and uncontrollable. However, it can be slowly absorbed into the body through the accumulation of time. At this moment, the chi of heaven and earth is flowing in my skinny body. That is the world inside my body. When these two worlds come into contact, a wonderful state is born. This is because the confinement is a Taoist technique and the circulation of qi in the body is a devil's skill. When Taoist technique and devil's skill meet, the old monk looked at the holy radiance that lingered around his fingers quietly and said calmly, "This is the divine skill." Trying to save the manuscript. I'm not used to it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qijian.
Calm to vote for me.
Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 273. The radiance around the skinny fingers gradually faded, and the flame that had no heat swayed. It was like a small oil lamp in the night wind, or a fishing fire in a storm. It seemed like it could be extinguished at any time, but it would never be extinguished. Yi Hongyu looked at the holy radiance between Master Lotus fingers, and her eyes were filled with confusion. Mo Shanshan's expression was no better than hers, and was filled with shock. They could clearly feel the holy aura contained in the light, and could not calm down as they pondered over Master Lotus words. Ning Ke's state of cultivation and knowledge was not as good as the two girls, so he was not as shocked as they were. He was only surprised that such a mysterious divine skill did not seem threatening at all. It was as if it did not exist in reality. The radiance between the old monk's skinny fingers was transparent and warm. It did not make one's eyes feel any burning pain, nor did it spread a scorching heat. Instead, it shone like the sun in the heavens and earth, revealing an indescribable supreme state. Mo Shanshan murmured, "If Taoism and the devil are interlinked, one can enter divinity." The old monk looked at her with a smile, and his eyes were filled with admiration. He said, "I have been thinking about the difference between Taoism and the devil for decades. I have used Taoism to form a world outside of my body, and used devil's power to form a world within my body. I have finally found a possibility, which is what you said." Upon hearing these words, Yi Hongyu finally woke up from her shock.
She thought of something.
Regardless of whether the connection between Taoism and the devil could lead to divinity, in order to attempt such an attempt, one would first have to join the devil. She stared blankly at the old monk in the Bone Mountain and felt that her judgment was a little disgraceful. How could divine Lord Lotus? You guessed correctly. I have indeed entered the devil. The old monk who was as skinny as a ghost sat on the Bone Mountain. The air had been dry for decades, and only the cracks on the roof that the Bone Mountain pointed at had a hint of moisture. The moisture had accumulated for a long time, and it finally condensed into a drop of water. The old monk slowly raised his head and opened his mouth slightly. The drop of water dripped into his dry lips, and then turned into a smile on the old monk's skinny face. The smile was compassionate, calm, and admirable. The old monk looked at her and said with a smile, Back then, I was worried that Koharan would enter the devil. I did not expect myself to enter the devil in the end. At this moment, Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu's consciousness were greatly shaken. They were a little muddle-headed, and each was immersed in their own thoughts. Only Ning Ke was still paying attention to the old monk's every move. Stepping into the Devil's Hall, Ning Ke met this legendary figure who had bound himself to atone for his sins for decades. Ning Ke had many questions in his heart. How did Master Lotus survive after not eating or drinking for decades? Later, when he saw that Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu did not have such doubts, he thought that this master's state had long surpassed the imagination of mortals and could abstain from eating. At this moment, looking at the drop of water condensed from the wetness in the stone crack on the roof falling into the old monk's dry lips, he could not help but be slightly startled. He thought that the old monk had a very clear grasp of the rhythm of the water dripping from the stone crack. Who knew how many times he had repeated it over the decades, or how many drops of water had he missed? It made his heart ache. How could he be so proficient? The scene of the wetness in the stone crack supporting a legendary figure who had sat to atone for his sins for decades would probably make anyone feel pity and respect for him. However, Ning Ke's heart was as hard as stone and refused to tremble. Instead, he raised his eyebrows slightly. If it was to atone for his sins, why did he have to beg for life? If it was to use the pain of life to respond to the severity of one's sins, why would he feel pain for missing a drop of water and thus raise his head to receive the water drop as an instinctive reaction? When Ning Ke was thinking about these things, Master Lotus had already started to debate with Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan about the highest and faraway scenery of the cultivation world. He could not help but frown. He thought that Master Lotus's debate in the Link Temple back then was so exciting that the Divine Hall Hierarch came to visit. He was definitely not someone like Prince Longqing could be compared to. This Devil's Hall must have been bored to the point of debating with himself every day for decades. How could they win against him? Indeed, as time passed, the old and compassionate voice was the only thing left in the room. If there is truth in the world, it should be understood through debate. What is the pursuit of cultivators? If we are searching for the way to understand the world and the power to change the world, then how can there be good and evil in power itself? Only those who use power will be able to differentiate between good and evil. A knife can be used to cut vegetables, carve radishes, or kill people. A stone can be used to admire, or to build a house, or to kill people. A lake can be used to breed fish, or to go boating, or to kill people. A mountain can be used to climb, or to build a house, or to kill people. Everything in the world can be used to please people, or to kill people. But everything is innocent. Only humans are the spirit of all things, and they give everything souls and uses. Therefore, the word sins can only be applied to humans. The difference between Taoism and the devil lies in the method and the path. Just like everything in the world, how can we incriminate them? The only thing that can be sinned is still humans. The old monk's words were not difficult or obscure at all. He did not use mysterious words to cover his words with a layer of mystery. He slowly explained these simple and plain principles, crushing the cultivation world that he knew for the three young people to listen to. The old monk's voice was weak, and his slightly hoarse voice was full of love for the world and compassion for all living beings. His tone was calm but convincing, and it could be said that any words he said were profound truths. Ning Ke did not listen carefully, but he was unknowingly attracted by the old monk's words. He sat on the ground and began to listen attentively. As the benevolent voice entered his ears, his tense mind since coming to the wilderness gradually relaxed, and his body also became relaxed. The room in the Devil's Palace seemed to have accumulated decades of loneliness, isolated from the world, and extremely quiet. Only the old monk's voice slowly bloomed like a lotus flower, gently echoing. These voices and words eventually turned into lotus petals that turned into spring water, reverberating between the walls and the soul. Wave by wave, it spread over and made people feel warm and comfortable. Among the corpses, there was a skeleton with half of its dried meat left. The skeleton raised its head to the sky, its withered bony claws stretched out behind its head like a cushion, and its fleshless right leg rested on its left knee, as if it was listening quietly and happily. It was not known whether it was because of the wind blowing or the dripping water, but the skeleton's head would occasionally nod twice, as if it was in agreement. After an unknown amount of time, the teaching and explanation that reverberated between the room and the soul slowly stopped. The old monk looked at the three young people with a gentle expression. Looking at their thoughtful expressions, he smiled and said, "The front gate has opened, and the world will definitely be troubled again." Carefully calculating, it is probably time for me to leave. Yi Hongyu looked up in shock, not knowing what to say. The old monk looked at his skinny hands that had unknowingly formed a lotus seal. After a moment of silence, he said indifferently, "My life, in the eyes of the secular world, is already considered wonderful. I was born in Buddhism and advanced to Taoism, but eventually followed the devil sect. Now that my life is coming to an end, I think that the great divine priest who founded the devil's doctrine 1,000 years ago said that those who know me will sin against me. Only time can hear me, and I can't help but feel that it is meaningless. But who can really be completely unconcerned about life and death? Even if you have already escaped from death, who cannot have a trace of nostalgia for the world? Do you want to leave some traces in this world? Even I am the same." The old monk slowly raised his head and looked at the three people in front of him. He smiled and said, "I have cultivated in 3 sects and have been trapped for decades to atone for my sins. I dare not say that I have achieved great success, but I have gained something. I would like to pass on the little power in this body and my knowledge of this world. I wonder who among you is willing to accept my mantle." It was rumored that the grand cultivators who had cultivated to the extreme could even vaguely feel the time when they would leave because they had a deep enough understanding of the world. Master Lotus had been trapped in the front gate of the devil's doctrine to atone for his sins. He had suffered in hunger and suffering for decades and finally encountered the reopening of the front gate and the younger generation of disciples. This kind of opportunity might be the wedge between life and death. Therefore, when they heard that he was about to leave this world, although the three of them were shocked, they were not completely unprepared. However, when they heard that Master Lotus had decided to pass on his mantle, even Ning Ke, who had been forcing himself to stay calm, could not help but be shaken. Yi Hongyu's sense of perception was even more unsettled. She clenched her fists tightly and could not say a word. The two most important things in life were the way to understand the world and the ability to change the world. The three of them had been listening to Master Lotus's method of understanding the world for a long time. The ability to change the world was naturally power and state. There was no such thing as passing on power in the right way of cultivation. Only the most powerful people in the devil's doctrine would pass on their power to their chosen successor through enlightenment before their lifespan ended. Master Lotus should be using this method to pass on his mantle. What kind of person was Master Lotus? Ning Ke had never heard of him before, but he was very clear now. He was well-versed in Taoism, Buddhism, and the devil's doctrine. He had been to 2 unknown places and had been the protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect. He had been the great divine priest of judgment of the divine hall and had almost gotten the position of the leader of the devil's doctrine. He was qualified to travel and be friends with youngest uncle. He had cultivated both Taoism and the devil's doctrine to the divine skill after staying in the Forbidden Mountain for decades. Such a person was, of course, the most powerful existence in the world. If he could inherit his mantle, how many years would he have to struggle on the long and difficult path of cultivation? How strong would he be able to get? What kind of magical world would he come into contact with? More importantly, Ning Ke was very clear that if he could inherit his mantle, perhaps it would not take long before he could tear General Xiahou, Princely Pei Yan, and even the shadows hiding behind them into pieces. He did not need to rely on the power of the academy, nor did he need to put his senior brothers and sisters in the back of the mountain in a dilemma. He could easily take revenge for the hatred that he had been guarding for more than 10 years. His parents who had loved him dearly in this life lying in a pool of blood, His young playmate who had been trampled to death, the chopper that was stained with black blood, the two people who had fallen in the woodshed, Darky who stood by the gray wall on a rainy day, and the innocent villagers who had died tragically in Darky's hometown. All of these images appeared in his mind at this moment, looking at him quietly. In fact, the hatred for the massacre of his family had already faded away in his heart. However, he was afraid of this indifference, so he wanted to engrave the hatred deep into his bones. This hatred, which had already changed its flavor, had become the most important spiritual support in Ning Kei's life. This support, when mixed with the innate greed for power, had become the most irresistible temptation. This kind of temptation was like an invisible hand, slowly lifting his body from the ground, urging him to move his feet with difficulty, walking towards the Bone Mountain. Suddenly, he stopped his steps. To avoid being beaten, I'll show you a silly smile. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 274. Ning Kei only needed to take a few more steps forward and climb up the Bone Mountain to receive Master Lotus' caress. Then, he would inherit all his achievements and become a top powerhouse in the world. He would then understand the wonders of Devil's Doctrine and enter the state of God. However, this meant that he would have to accept the Devil's Doctrine's genuine qi. When Taoism and the devil were connected, one could enter the state of God. This sounded wonderful. However, under the luxurious robe, the naked reality was still the same as before. Enlightenment was a secret method of the Devil's Doctrine. It could not be passed on through enlightenment or the state of psyche power. It could only exist in reality. The qi of heaven and earth that was absorbed from nature was not the Devil's Doctrine. To enter the state of God, one must first enter the Devil's Doctrine. In the secluded hall, Master Lotus could gently talk about the Devil's Doctrine. However, in the real world outside the mountain, the Devil's Doctrine was still an evil existence that could not be tolerated in the world. It was an evil that all the countries and sects in the Central Plains wanted to destroy. Ning Kei was the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. Yi Hongyu was the most beloved Tao addict among the younger generation of the West Hill Divine Palace. However, even people of their status would be abandoned by the whole world once they were discovered to have entered the Devil's Doctrine. Just like this magnificent mountain range in the north of the wilderness. He would enter the devil if he took a few more steps.
How could he take that step?
However, the temptation of inheriting Master Lotus's mantle and becoming a powerhouse with unparalleled power and cultivation was so fresh and powerful. How could he let go of such an opportunity? Ning Kei felt that his legs were as heavy as a few thousand taels of silver. He could not move an inch. Yi Hongyu's ears seemed to still be reverberating with the gentle and compassionate voice of Divine Lord Lotus. Her eyes were a little empty. Occasionally, there would be a glimmer of determination, but it would instantly turn into a struggle of pain. Just like Ning Kei, her spiritual world was also in an extremely unstable but relaxed state. Her thoughts were swaying with Master Lotus's teachings. She was swaying between what she had learned from Haotian Taoism and pure logic. Inheriting the mantle of Divine Lord Lotus was an unimaginable temptation to any cultivator. However, if it was just this temptation, it would not be enough to make her, who had a strong Taoist heart, interested in the Devil's Doctrine. However, deep in her heart, she could not refute Divine Lord Lotus' point of view. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that it made sense. The eyebrows on Yi Hongyu's beautiful face were tightly furrowed. She looked like she was in great pain. She stretched out her left hand and grabbed her plump and soft breasts. Her fingers dug in deeply, as if she was trying to dig out her uneasy heart. Because she used too much strength, the wound on her left shoulder, which had been injured by several arrows, burst open again. Blood slowly flowed out. She murmured, "Is there really a third path?" Mo Shanshan, who was kneeling on the ground, had turned extremely pale at this moment. Her lips were pursed into a straight line, and her beautiful ink-like eyes were unable to focus at all, appearing extremely scattered. Master Lotus did not rush them, nor did he show any impatience. He looked at them calmly and gently. There was a faint benevolent smile on his skinny face. Perhaps he hoped that they could cross the threshold themselves and make their own choice. The strong spiritual impact caused by the difference between Taoism and the devil caused Ningke and the other two to fall into a painful spiritual struggle. This kind of pain caused their minds to be absent-minded and unstable. However, it was accompanied by a very clear and relaxed state of mind. Gradually, the pain and struggle began to flow away like water. The aura that lingered in their sense of perception turned into warm spring water, and the clear and relaxed stable state of mind once again occupied their bodies. The negative emotions like fear and struggle gradually faded away. The three of them instinctively felt very safe. Master Lotus was as pure as a lotus. There was no need for him to deceive them into joining the devil, nor would he have any ulterior motives towards them. If such a peerless powerhouse wanted to hurt them, he would not need to spend so much effort. The real reason that made them calm and relaxed was still the temptation. The temptation of inheriting the legacy of the previous powerhouses, the temptation of understanding the original truth of the world, and the temptation of merging Taoism and the devil to enter divinity. This temptation was the grassland, the starry sky, the sweet taste of milk cakes when they were young, the arrogant aura of standing on the peak of the mountain, and the possibility of writing one's name on the mottled city wall for the future generations. The door of temptation was slowly opening in front of them. Behind the door was an unfamiliar, fresh, and fertile grassland. As long as they were willing, they could lie on this green grassland that was as soft as a blanket and look at the beautiful starry sky that they had never seen before. They could enjoy everything quietly. Among the three of them, Yi Hongyu's state was the highest, and she had the deepest understanding of cultivation. She had seen those truly powerful powers before, and she stubbornly and focused on pursuing them. Hence, she felt the greatest temptation at this moment. Suddenly, she heard the creaking sound of the broken wooden bed shaking. She saw her legs that were as thin and weak as reed sticks when she was young. She recalled the humiliating and angry past. Then, she saw her brother who had his hair combed into a bun and carried a wooden sword on his back. At that time, her brother was still a proud young man, but he was already so lonely. As time passed, her brother became more and more lonely. Was it because no matter how hard I tried, I could not catch up to your footsteps? If I had the ability to stand side by side with you, standing on the precipitous cliff and facing the cold mountain wind, would you not feel so lonely? She raised her head in confusion and realized that Divine Lord Lotus was looking at her with a pitiful gaze, as if he had seen through all her disguises. She suddenly felt cold and terrified, because she felt that the door was about to close in front of her. Not being possessed by the devil, not being possessed by the devil, she muttered to herself, but her eyes became brighter and brighter. She lifted her feet and walked up the bone mountain.
Yes. No.
She walked to the front of Divine Lord Lotus and knelt on the ground. Her knees crushed a few white bones. She lowered her head humbly and devoutly removed all the shackles that her heart had on the outside world. She opened up her spiritual world honestly. Ning Ke was also subconsciously looking up at the starry sky on the green grassland. His mind was calm and clear. However, the pure temptation that was hidden in this beautiful picture was still lacking the last bit of strength to make him take that step. As he had stayed in front of the door for too long, his thoughts started to wander, and he vaguely felt that something was wrong. A ray of light appeared in his mind. It was not like a lightning bolt, but more like a spring rain. It instantly calmed him down and freed him from his current mental state. He thought of a few points that he did not understand previously. If he had bound himself to atone for his sins, why would he need to wear chains on his body? Could it be that someone like Master Lotus, who had reached such a high state, would also fall into the boring state of using his body to atone for his sins? How firm was the will of such a legendary figure? He had seen the prosperity of the world and had experienced life and death. How could he suddenly and inexplicably go against the Tao and Buddhist heart just because his youngest martial uncle broke into the mountain gate and killed a group of demons with his sword? Even if it was himself, he could not be moved after seeing so many cruel scenes, let alone a powerhouse like this. These doubts kept hitting his mind like raindrops. In the end, they converged into a certain possibility. This old monk was not binding himself to atone for his sins, but he was locked up here to suffer and atone for his sins. Thinking of this, Ning Ke woke up in shock. He realized that the warmth that surrounded him like spring water and the benevolent and peaceful aura had all disappeared. The environment was still dry and slightly cold. He understood that he had been controlled by the old monk's mental power previously. He looked towards the bone mountain in shock. He saw the Tao addict kneeling in the pile of white bones in front of the old monk. The old monk's skinny palm had already landed on her head. A strong sense of terror instantly took over his body. Mo Shanshan walked to the edge of the bone mountain in a daze. Ning Ke shouted and stretched out his hand to grab her. Then, he used the fastest speed to untie the iron bow on his back. He pulled the bow and arrow and aimed at the old monk who was once as benevolent as Buddha, but was now as gloomy as a ghost. The skinny old palm wrapped in thin skin slowly landed on the girl's head and gently stroked it. Feeling the delicate touch from the black hair, a painful struggle suddenly appeared in the old monk's eyes that were as warm as a spring lake. The struggle only lasted for a moment. The gentle benevolence on the old monk's skinny face instantly turned into extreme fanaticism and finally into extreme calmness and indifference. There was no emotion in his eyes that were as deep as the stars in the night. A breath that was not strong but pure and thick spurted out from the bottom of the old monk's palm. Yi Hongyu suddenly opened her eyes and looked at the old monk's face that was inches away from her. She felt the psyche power in her sense of perception leaking out of her body like a flood. Her body suddenly became weak and she understood what was happening. Her bright eyes were filled with coldness and her graceful body bounced up like a fish. Accompanied by a sharp roar, her hands changed 4 types of sword gestures in the air. She condensed the chi of heaven and earth around her into a virtual sword and directly stabbed towards the old monk's chest. She was indeed the powerful Tao addict. In the face of such an unexpected situation, facing the divine Lord Lotus who had always been regarded as a god in the cultivation world, she made the fastest and most correct response that a strong cultivator could make. Her response was simple, direct, and cold. She attacked with a ruthless Taoism skill that would die together with her. However, this Taoism sword that contained her decades of hard work and could even be said to be the most powerful Taoism sword that she had ever displayed in her life was completely useless. This was because she could not condense the chi of heaven and earth even after changing 4 types of sword gestures. There was chi of heaven and earth everywhere. As long as there was chi of heaven and earth, it could be sensed and used by the psyche power. The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, was proficient in all kinds of Taoism skills. In such a life and death situation, she would not have any problems with her Taoism skills. There was only one explanation for why she could not condense the chi of heaven and earth. There was no chi of heaven and earth around the old monk at all. There were many ways to isolate the chi of heaven and earth in the world. However, there was only one way to make the chi of heaven and earth disappear completely. Even with Yi Hongyu's vast knowledge, she only knew of one way: the real confinement. Yi Hongyu was naturally very familiar with the confinement of the judicial department. She was also one of the few people who had seen the confinement that the great divine priest of judgment had set up. However, the confinement that the great divine priest of light had trapped for more than 10 years was not as powerful as the one in front of her. Feeling the release of the psyche power and the weakness in her body, she lowered her head and knelt on the white bones. Looking at the craggy white bones, her gradually blurred vision finally gave birth to a look of despair. The white bones as the fence and the dried corpses as the fence. It was such a powerful and terrifying confinement. The stone in my chest was slightly released, and I felt less suffocated. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.
Come to vote for me.
Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 275. When the Tao addict was captured, Ning Ke instinctively wanted to escape with Mo Shanshan, as far as he could. However, he did not do so. Instead, he prepared to use the primordial 13 arrows to solve all of this, as he knew that he would not be able to escape. When he pinched the cold tail of the talisman arrow, the old monk's skinny palm had already started to emit a strong aura. When he pulled the iron bow to its fullest, Yi Hongyu had already lowered her head and collapsed. He saw the despair in Yi Hongyu's eyes, as well as Master Lotus's emotionless and cold gaze. Mo Shanshan was startled awake by him from the illusion, and she sobered up in an instant. Her beautiful black hair that was like a waterfall suddenly fluttered behind her, and her right hand trembled in the air. She knew that the three of them were in a hopeless situation, so she immediately used her strongest half-divine talisman. Facing such a powerful double attack, the old monk who was sitting in the Bone Mountain was still expressionless. He only glanced at them, and his gaze fell into the eyes of the two. With just one glance, Ning Ke felt an unbearable pain in his head, as if second brother's wooden club was hitting his head at a speed that could not be seen by the naked eye. He blacked out and loosened his fingers. Mo Shanshan felt that her chest and abdomen were suddenly cut open by a sharp blade. The stone array tactics that she had accumulated in the big array outside the front gate all gushed out. However, there was no joy, only endless pain. Her fingers that were drawing the talisman froze. The talisman arrow left the bow like a black shadow. At this moment, Ning Ke's sense of perception was in a mess, and he could not control it at all. The iron arrow shot out with a swoosh and shot into a corner of the Devil's Hall. It directly broke the huge stones there and piled them up into a corner of the Devil's Hall. The divine talisman that was brewing between Mo Shanshan's slender fingers instantly became dim and weak. It was like a small oil lamp in a room with no air circulation, and suddenly extinguished by a strong gust of wind. Blood spurted out from their mouths at almost the same time. They fell to the ground weakly and could no longer stand up. Master Lotus's expression was indifferent and emotionless as he looked at the two who fell to the ground with blood spurting out from their mouths. His deep-set eyes were dark and cold. They were as thin as rice grains and looked extremely demonic. His shriveled chest and abdomen seemed even more hollow than before. It seemed like a casual glance, but in fact, it contained an extremely terrifying state. The old monk had been imprisoned for decades, and it took him decades to condense his psyche power again. Master Lotus looked expressionlessly at Yi Hongyu, who was kneeling in front of him. He slowly stroked her hair with his palm, as if he was a gentle lover. Then he smiled. His smile was still as gentle and kind. With such a gentle and compassionate smile, he leaned over and lowered his head against Tao Addict's slightly cold cheek. As if he was kissing or whispering, he gently touched her left shoulder with his lips and began to suck gently. His aged lips were like leeches greedily sucking on the young girl's delicate naked skin. His thin and shriveled cheeks were moving rhythmically. Fresh blood slowly entered his lips, moisturizing his throat that had been thirsty for many years and began to nourish his organs that had not felt any warmth for many years. After a while, the old monk raised his head and looked at the young girl in his palm. His eyes were gentle and compassionate. A faint but exquisite aura of Buddhism appeared on his face. Even the drop of blood at the corner of his chapped lips was compassionate. Her sense of perception was completely controlled, and her psyche power was completely drained. Her body was so weak that she could not even move her fingers. The powerful Tao addict was now weaker than a baby. However, she only looked at the old monk indifferently and did not have any reaction. She knew that she would not be able to escape today. She was so proud that she would not beg for mercy. Even when she felt the pain and disgust from her shoulder, she still remained calm. This was because she did not want Divine Lord Lotus to have the slightest possibility of getting pleasure from it. This was the only resistance that she could do before her death. Your blood is filled with the power of light. It is extremely pure and rich Taoist aura. Even decades ago, I rarely had the chance to taste such power. Master Lotus looked at her beautiful face gently and said with pity, "It is a pity that you are no longer a virgin. The shadow in your Taoist heart has added some impatience to your blood. Otherwise, you could be compared to the pure charm of Xiao Xiao in the past." Upon hearing this, Yi Hongyu's hands that were powerless to support herself on the ground trembled slightly. However, she remained stubborn and cold without saying a word. Suddenly, her pupils shrank slightly. This was because she saw a very strange scene. Master Lotus's face, which was as skinny as a ghost, seemed to be slightly plumper than before. His dry and pale lips seemed to have a tinge of redness, and a surge of vitality was born spontaneously. Yi Hongyu thought of a certain legendary Devil's Doctrine skill, and could not help but feel a chill down her spine. Master Lotus did not look at her anymore. He raised his head and looked at the wetness in the cracks of the roof. Perhaps it was because his vitality was gradually recovering, or perhaps it was because of the fresh blood of the young girl. He could not help but start to recall the glorious and beautiful past. He muttered, "When the South Jin Kingdom was newly established, there were beauties dancing in the court." The old and slightly hoarse voice stopped abruptly. He looked at the two people on the ground whose life and death was unknown. Ning Ke was neither dead nor unconscious. He only felt that his body was in extreme pain, as if it was falling apart. His consciousness could not control the movements of his body. He understood that it should be, because his sense of perception had been severely injured by the old monk's gaze. He used his elbows to support himself on the ground, and wanted to climb up. He wanted to draw his bow and arrow again. He wanted to take out the big black umbrella behind him and his 3 knives. However, he could not complete any of his actions. He could only look at the old monk in despair. The old monk had only casually glanced at them, and he and the calligraphy addict had been completely defeated. It was really frightening. In the midst of pain and absent-mindedness, Ning Ke remembered that he had once asked his master how a fight in the knowing destiny state was like. At that time, Master Yen Sei had used Second Brother of the Academy as an example. He had said that as long as Second Brother looked at you, you would die. This old monk, who had been imprisoned in the Bone Mountain for decades, was extremely weak and almost half dead. At this moment, he could reach the pinnacle level of Second Brother with just a casual glance. Then what kind of horrifying state had this person cultivated to when he was full of spirit and healthy back then? Could it be that he had already transcended the mortal realm and broken through the 5 states? At this moment, the old monk looked at him. He saw the strange changes on the old monk's face and was shocked speechless. He could not understand what was going on. Mo Shanshan had been extremely weak because she had thought too much about breaking the Great Blockage Formation. Previously, when the half-divine talisman was broken by the old monk's gaze, she had been seriously injured. At this moment, looking at the strange changes on Master Lotus's face, her body trembled violently. Her eyes were filled with uncontrollable fear as she said with a trembling voice, "Tao Tai, could it be? Could it be? Tao Tai?" There was a record in the West Hill Divine Palace's teachings that there was an ancient beast named Tao Tai. It had a head but no body, and was greedy for food. There was another record about Tao Tai in the West Hill Divine Palace's teachings. It was an extremely evil skill of the Devil's Doctrine. The powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine who cultivated this skill would devour the flesh and blood of other cultivators to strengthen their aura. They were greedy and murderous. They were the most sinister and evil. Even the people of the Devil's Doctrine were ashamed to be the same as them. The Tao Tai skill that even the Devil's Doctrine despised was undoubtedly one of the evilest skills in the world. Ning Ke had never heard of such a devil skill. However, the scene of Lotus gently sucking the blood from Yi Hongyu's wound had already shocked him greatly. Later on, Master Lotus vitality was recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. Connecting the two, he could naturally guess what it meant. Ever since he came to this world, he had seen many cruel things. He had even seen many more horrifying and bloody scenes. He knew that life and death were fated and could be said to be fearless. However, when he thought about how he would be slowly devoured by this old monk who was as skinny as a ghost, the shadow that was left in his heart when he was young suddenly expanded. This caused his face to instantly turn pale and his eyes to be filled with fear. Perhaps it was to overcome the fear in his heart. Ning Ke said to Mo Shanshan, who was beside him, "Don't be afraid of him. He has been trapped for decades and is already at his limit." The previous gaze had already exhausted the psyche power that he had painstakingly accumulated. If he could still fight, he would have killed both of us long ago. He wouldn't even be unable to get rid of the iron chain that pierced through his abdomen. The old monk looked at him and said gently, "Your eyesight is indeed not bad." Since the old monk was temporarily unable to get rid of the iron chain and still needed to use the devil's skill to turn the Tao addict's flesh and blood into his own strength, what Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan had to do now was to race against time to see who could recover faster than the old monk. Ning Ke sat with his legs crossed and closed his eyes. Mo Shanshan retracted her left leg and sat down with great difficulty. The two of them began to meditate at the same time. However, after a while, the two of them opened their eyes in shock and despair. When Master Lotus looked at them, the two of them felt a strong impact on their spirits. This impact even affected their internal organs, and their sense of perception was severely injured. At this moment, they could not even enter the usual meditation that they were so familiar with. The two of them looked at each other and chose to give up tacitly. They were prepared to try using the method of talisman Taoism. After all, the psyche power required for talisman Taoism was slightly lesser. However, in the next moment, they realized that even this method could not be used. The qi of heaven and earth in this dark room was so thin that it was almost non-existent. The psyche power required for talisman Taoism was extremely little. However, talisman Taoism was ultimately the use of the qi of heaven and earth. If there was no qi of heaven and earth, what was the use of talisman Taoism? The gentle and compassionate voice of Master Lotus resounded in the room. The white bones as the fence and the dried corpses as the bars are just the appearance. In reality, this confinement is made of green stones as the fence and sword marks as the bars. It was personally set up by Kaharan. Even I can't cast it, let alone break it, let alone kids like you. The confinement array set up by youngest uncle himself? Ning Ke looked around in shock, only to find that there were thousands of deep sword marks hidden among the mottled marks on the stone walls. Those sword marks seemed to have no connection with each other, but they formed a barrier like a curtain of night, preventing the aura of heaven and earth outside the devil's palace from seeping in. Up till now, there were still many things hidden behind the fog. However, Ning Ke could be sure of something. He looked at the old monk in the Bone Mountain and said, "Indeed, you did not bind yourself to atone for your sins. Instead, you were locked here by youngest uncle to atone for your sins." The old monk was silent for a long time. A clear glow appeared on his slightly withered face. He said proudly, "Only the spring and autumn period can hear me. Whether it is you, the world, or Kaharan, none of you are qualified to do so." Ning Ke's voice trembled as he asked, "Who are you?" "Arhut, Taoist priest, big devil, immortal tiger, and mangy dog."
I have played too many roles in my life.
In the end, I almost forgot who I am. Am I the great divine priest of the divine hall, the front gate protector of the Buddhism sect, or the great priest of the devil's doctrine? However, what does the appearance of my identity have to do with the real you and me? The benevolent and gentle expression gradually disappeared with the wind. The old monk gently waved his tattered sleeves. He looked charming and free. He said indifferently, "I am the 32 petals of a lotus. Each petal is different. I wonder why the world always compares the beauty of one petal to the shape of a lotus. If I want to be a Buddha, I will be a Buddha. If I want to be a devil, I will be a devil." As his voice fell, the old monk looked at Yi Hongyu pitifully. He lowered his head and bit it. Then he moved his head left and right and tore off a piece of flesh with difficulty. He began to chew seriously and attentively. My neck is uncomfortable again. Fortunately, tomorrow is Saturday.
Amit Ba.
See you the day after tomorrow. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.
Calm to vote for me.
Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 276. Fresh human flesh was always difficult to chew, especially for an old monk who had lost all his teeth. That was why he chewed very seriously, his skinny cheeks constantly trembling. Compassion and pity, as well as greed and bloodthirstiness, these two completely different emotions, were constantly changing in that pair of eyes that were still as calm as a spring lake. As the flesh that was chewed into a paste was swallowed into his stomach and absorbed, the old monk's sunken eyes gradually brightened. His skinny cheeks gradually filled up, and his face that was as withered as a piece of wood gradually revealed a stronger liveliness. The girl's forearm was like a pure white lotus root that had been washed clean by the lake water. Accompanied by a terrifying ripping sound, a piece of flesh was bitten off while she was still alive. Blood flowed down from the wound. Her face was pale, but she pressed her lips together and refused to let out a cry of pain. The old monk stuck out his black tongue and licked the blood off the corner of his lips. He still maintained a compassionate expression on his face. However, the more it was so, the more chilling the contrast was. Ning Ke looked at the scene and felt a chill run down his spine. The development of the situation was too unexpected. Be it him or Yi Hongyu, they had never thought that Master Lotus, who was known for his noble character, would actually be such a terrifying devil. Most importantly, the aura that this old monk exuded was so pure and compassionate. Even if he had some doubts in his heart, he instinctively did not want to suspect this old monk. Master Lotus, who had already swallowed the mouthful of flesh and blood, seemed to have turned back into the highly respected and compassionate Vedanta of the Buddhism sect in an instant. He looked at Yi Hongyu, who was under his palm. He saw the despair and hatred in the girl's eyes. He stretched out his finger and slowly slid it across her delicate face. He said pitifully, "You're so cute. How could I do this to you?" Yi Hongyu's sense of perception was controlled, and she lost control of her body. However, her consciousness and senses were still sharp. She could clearly feel that she was becoming weaker and weaker. She also felt that the thin finger on her face was as cold and terrifying as a snake's tongue. Why did I do that? Why didn't I resist the temptation of flesh and blood? The old monk's eyes became a little hollow and a little confused. He murmured to himself and suddenly laughed at himself. He shook his head and sighed. At a glance, the two children in the see-through realm are still alive. After decades of condensing such a pitiful amount of psyche power, they have all been used up. Lotus, you are too weak now. His expression became calm again, and he gently explained to himself and the three young people in the room, "I've been struggling on the edge of life and death for decades. I could die at any time, so I have to eat something." His explanation sounded normal and natural, but it sounded extremely cold to the ears of Ning Ke and the other two. Ning Ke was now sure that youngest uncle had broken into the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine with a single sword decades ago. But for some reason, he did not kill this person. Instead, he locked him up here with a big inhibition and made him suffer from hunger and loneliness for decades. Decades passed by. No matter how profound and powerful the old monk's realm was, he could not withstand such inhuman torture. Gradually, he was on the verge of death. At this moment, the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was reopened due to the change in the cycle of time. The three of them accidentally came here and became the old monk's greatest hope of escaping. That was why there were so many discussions about Taoism. The old monk used his Buddha's mercy to make the three gradually lower their guard. Then, he used the great temptation of passing on his mantle to make the Tao addict open up her spiritual world. From then on, they were restrained. Ning Ke frowned and said, "Regardless of whether it is Master Lotus or Divine Lord Lotus, they both have a supreme reputation in the cultivation world. I have never heard of your name, but these two girls kowtowed to you the moment they saw you. It is obvious that they trust you very much. You can totally wait for us to rescue you. Why do you have to take such a risk?" The old monk smiled and said, "Because you can't break this array. Only I, who have recovered my strength, can break this confinement. And if I want to recover my strength, I have to eat you. Even if we can't break this confinement, our elders in the sect can." The old monk laughed and said, "In this world, there are only a handful of people besides me who can break the confinement set by Crazy Ko. There are indeed people among the elders in your sect who can do it. Unfortunately, these people all know the story of what happened in the past and know my secret. If they know that I am still alive, they will definitely not choose to save me. Instead, they will not hesitate to destroy half the world with me in order to kill me and then burn my bones to ashes." Ning Ke was startled and then said, "It seems like you are not a likable person." The old monk sighed and continued, "After accompanying the corpses for so many years, I have actually given up the hope of leaving. But I did not expect the front gate to be reopened one day. What's more, I did not expect the first batch to enter the front gate to be 3 cute and pitiful children. I think this is probably fate's arrangement." Ning Ke was silent. He thought to himself that the 3 addicts in the world and him, a disciple of the second floor of the academy, were probably qualified to stir up a few storms in the cultivation world today. But in the eyes of this powerhouse of the previous generation, they were just 3 cute and pitiful children. Time was indeed the most important factor for cultivators. The psyche power that I have accumulated over the decades is indeed not much. But from the moment you entered the hall, I started to use the questioning heart skill of the Buddhism sect. I thought that you were the weakest among the 3 of you and would be the first to enter the illusion. But I did not expect you to be the only one to maintain a clear mind. I am very curious as to how you did it." The old monk looked at him and said with a carefree smile. Although his appearance was still skinny and ugly, his carefree and arrogant aura that looked down on the common people was completely evident. He was like a mad scholar who was holding a wine pot and discussing the Tao. Ning Ke guessed that he should be seizing the time to absorb the blood food in his stomach. But he did not expose him. Instead, he continuously tightened the subtle muscles in his body at a high frequency and replied, "Perhaps the temptation you gave was not enough." The old monk frowned slightly and looked at him. He asked, "Is my mantle not attractive to you?" Ning Ke said with slight mockery, "Of course I yearn for power, but it must be true." The old monk smiled and said, "When Taoism and the devil are interlinked, one can enter the divine state. This is what I have comprehended over the years. I did not lie to you." Ning Ke was slightly startled and said, "But you still need to enter the devil first." The old monk was like a goshawk in the blue sky looking at a chicken in the fence. He looked at him coldly and said, "I have said before that the academy is indeed not as good as the previous generation. You are actually so scared by the words 'enter the devil.'" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "If it is a need before life and death, entering the devil is nothing. But first, I must be willing and not have a heart of doubt. Otherwise, what is the apatheicized God? And since it is a temptation, it must have some weight. The temptation that you showed me with the Buddhist sweet sound is not enough for me." There was contempt and disdain in his words. At this moment, Lotus was not an eminent monk Vedanta, but a chic and even domineering man. He squinted his eyes slightly and said with displeasure and mockery, "Is there anything in the world that is more attractive than my mantle?" Ning Ke suddenly laughed. "I am a disciple of the second floor of the academy. In the future, I will inherit the headmaster's mantle. Even if I enter the devil, I can still learn what youngest uncle left behind. I think this weight should be more important." The old monk was speechless when he heard this. Even if he was so proud that he regarded the 3 sects of Taoism, Buddhism, and the devil as broken shoes, he did not dare to think that he was higher than the headmaster of the academy. As for his lifelong enemy, Kaharan, he had left him endless humiliation and pain. And I have never met a truly selfless person in my life. I always thought that a bowl of fragrant fried egg noodles would not appear on the table out of nowhere. So the more pitiful and touching you were, the more uncomfortable I felt. Ning Ke continued, I am very curious about those stories that you told me earlier. Which of them is true? Or are they all ghost stories that you purposely told us to lower our guard? Those stories had the shadow of youngest uncle's shadow, so he was very concerned. However, the old monk sitting on the bone mountain and the young man sitting on the ground were clearly in a life and death situation. Yet, they had the leisure to gossip about such things. This scene was unavoidably a little strange. The old monk said with a pitiful expression, those stories that I told you earlier are all true, but there are some key points that I did not make clear. The massacre of the Link Temple was planned by me. The beautiful dancer was eventually sucked dry by me. Her face was very pale after she died, so pale that it was almost transparent. But strangely, there was still a sweet smile on her pale face, as if she was asking me why I did it. He looked at Ning Ke and said calmly, at that time, I was very afraid of the smile on her face. I tried to wipe it off with my hands, but I could not. So in the end, I cut her into pieces and ate her. That was also the first time I ate a human. Ning Ke was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he asked, who is that dancer? The old monk smiled and said, she wanted to turn Kohaoran into a madman. Naturally, it was his woman who died. Ning Ke heard this answer and was silent for a long time. Then, he asked, was it to provoke a war between the Academy and the Divine Hall? Or was it for some other reason? The old monk was silent for a moment. Then, he said expressionlessly, there was no other reason. It was just that Kohaoran saw through it in the end. And Wei Guangming, that blockhead, somehow began to suspect my identity. I had no choice but to quietly leave the Peach Mountain and return to the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Then these things happened. Listening to the gradually turbid aura, Ning Ke was sure that this once peerless powerhouse was about to die after being imprisoned by a youngest uncle for decades. If it was a head-on battle, he would not be a match for the three of them. However, this person had actually set up such a trap in such a short time. He was indeed a meticulous and terrifying person. However, thinking back to decades ago, this person had dominated the Buddhism, Taoism, and the Devil's Doctrine. In the end, he had almost caused the whole world to fall into a bloody hell. For someone with such great ability to deal with the three of them was like a butcher knife to a chicken. It was natural that he could easily put them in such a desperate and dangerous situation. Ning Ke looked at the old monk and asked his real question. Regardless of Taoism, Devil's Doctrine, or Buddhism, you are a respected bigwig. No matter which side you choose, or even if you don't choose, you can still become a legend in the history books. However, you chose the most bloody and boring path.
Why?
Why do you have to be the enemy of the world? These words sound familiar. The old monk looked at him and said slowly, many years ago, Wei Guangming often reflected on himself like this. He did not hesitate to be the enemy of the world because he believed that he was right. But I am different. The reason why I am the enemy of the world is very simple. It is because I know that the world is wrong. A friendly recommendation for a new book, Rootless Tao, book number 223-7246. The author is an old reader of The Spy. To be honest, I really do not have the time to read this book. If you're interested, please give it a try. Perhaps you will like it. The book already has nearly 500,000 words. According to the author, there are still 100,000 manuscripts left. The future is promising. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 277. Many readers probably didn't see the author's announcement. It was written in the author's information at the beginning of the book. I was afraid that you didn't see it, so I wanted to remind you that I have moved to the introduction. For thousands of years, having the freedom to eat meat and the ability to eat meat is the goal that we, the spirits of all living things, strive for. All of a sudden, the old monk's extremely long white eyebrows fluttered without any wind. He was not floating like an immortal, but inexplicably irritable. His eyes widened and his skinny hand rubbed the girl's hair hard. He shouted, "How can there be any reason in this world? I am the great divine priest of judgment, and once sat on the seat of heavenly black jade. I am the high priest of the devil's doctrine, and can choose a suzerain. I am the protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect, and can serve tens of thousands of monks. How glorious and proud have I been in my life! How can there be any reason in this world? Look at this dirty world. Who knows how many mediocre idiots are living in it? Don't you feel that the air you breathe is so dirty and stinky? Don't you feel that breathing is extremely uncomfortable when you have a thief who has been silent for so many years? It is natural for people to eat meat in this world. Eating pigs, dogs, chickens, and heaven and earth. How can there be any reason?" Ning Ke suddenly said, "But this does not include eating people." The old monk fell silent again. After some time, the merciful aura returned to him. He said thoughtfully and slowly, "Yes, there is always some reason in this world. It is just that the level of reason is different. In my opinion, the way you and I exist in this world is the combination of our own ways of understanding the world. After that night of bitter rain in the tomb, I have been trying hard to understand the true origin of the world. In the end, I changed the way I exist in this world. Finally, I want to change this world and find the world that I can no longer return to." When I was enlightened and debated in the Link Temple, the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace praised my eloquence and invited me to enter the Devil's Doctrine on behalf of the Central Plains Orthodox sects. However, he did not know that I was actually a member of the Devil's Doctrine from the day I was born. A childlike smile appeared on the old monk's skinny face. There were no teeth in his parted lips, so he looked more like a baby that had just been born. He gave off a feeling of innate purity, and even his mockery was so naive. "I only pursue power and find a way to change the world. I don't care about the difference between Taoism and demonic Tao, nor do I care about who wins or loses. The reason why I'm willing to come to the Devil Sect is because I want to see the lost heavenly book." However, the Ming hand scroll was not in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. The people of the Devil's Doctrine hiding in the mountains, hiding in the countries of the Central Plains like rats, and fanning the flames like women, disgusted me, so I left again. The old monk's face showed a strong look of mockery and disgust. He was like a woman in the marketplace who looked at other people selling vinegar with 2 bowls of water, full of pride and disdain. I went to the great river of the South Jin Kingdom, to the Yueluan Kingdom, and finally to the west, to the faraway unknown place. In the Xiankong Temple, I finally heard the preaching of the chief monk, saw the clear Buddha light, and heard the deafening words of Buddha. However, after a few years, I finally realized that the monks in the Xiankong Temple were just some filthy things. The so-called words of Buddha were deliberately mystifying, and they were no different from the fortune-tellers on the streets of the Kingdom of Song. What was even more disgusting was that the Buddhism sect cultivated themselves so that they could only wait humbly in the face of the transfer of fate. How could they reach the other side like this? The old monk's white eyebrows floated up and then fell back down. His eyes were full of dissatisfaction, like a young scholar who stopped the Prime Minister's sedan chair on the road and asked how to pull himself together if the country was not at peace. Obviously, his impression of the unknown place of the Buddhism sect was much better than his impression of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. However, he was still angry at the other party's lack of ambition. Finally, I returned from the wilderness and officially accepted the invitation of the hierarch to secretly join the West Hill Divine Palace. With the help of my trusted followers in the Devil's Doctrine, I killed 2 extremely stupid elders. Only then did I reveal my identity and sit on the Black Jade Throne of Judgment. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan had been listening in silence. Finally, they could not help but ask, "Since you are a member of the Devil's Doctrine, why did you help the West Hill Divine Palace to kill your own elders? If I didn't do that, how could I win the trust of Haotian Taoism? If I didn't do that, how could that shabby temple let me, a successor of the Xiankong Temple, read their treasured books? However, that shabby temple was extremely stingy. Even though I did so many things for Haotian Taoism, they only let me read the Ri hand scroll and the Bishop hand scroll. The old monk said coldly, even though I only read 2 volumes of the Tomes of Arcane, they are indeed extraordinary. I thought I had finally found the right place and had the opportunity to understand the real world. However, after staying on Peach Mountain for a few days, I found that the West Hill Divine Palace is a group of cowardly idiots. He suddenly looked down and saw that Yi Hongyu's eyes were already filled with anger. He knew that his mockery of the West Hill Divine Palace had angered the girl. He could not help but laugh and said, "Poor child. Am I wrong to say that? Hundreds of millions of Haotian disciples in the world only know about the Divine Hall, but not the Jisho Abbey. Those sitting in the white temples on Peach Mountain should know what they should do if they had the courage and backbone. But how did they do it? They look high and mighty, but in the end, they are being ordered around by a shabby Taoist temple." Thinking of the cyan robe in that shabby Taoist temple, the old monk's expression slightly froze. Then he said mockingly, "They are all a group of dogs. So what if it is that shabby Taoist temple? After all, they are still dogs raised by Haotian. Haha, they are all dogs." Arrogant laughter burst out from his dried lips that were stained with blood. The old monk's white eyebrows flew up, as if they were dancing. He was full of heroic spirit and looked like a young swordsman who was walking in the countryside with a sword in hand, looking for injustice. The slightly hoarse, but full of heroic laughter echoed in the quiet and dim room. Ning Kai stared blankly at the old monk who was leaning forward and backward on the White Bones Mountain, as if he would fall at any time. He could clearly feel the wild meaning in the laughter. He could not help but think that this person was indeed qualified to call youngest uncle a friend back then. It was indeed somewhat reasonable. After walking in the world for so many years and searching for so many years, there are still dogs everywhere. After thinking about it, I still think that the great divine priest of light who founded the Devil's Doctrine was interesting, so I returned to the Devil's Doctrine. The old monk said indifferently, "However, I did not expect that after so many years, the Devil's Doctrine is still as dirty as it was back then." The good-for-nothing who occupied the position of suzerain became more and more senile and muddle-headed. He even wanted to abolish the inheritance of the saintess of the Devil's Doctrine because he could not bear to part with his own daughter. The rest of the people were even more immersed in the boring pleasure of killing. They were as boring as beasts. At this time, I finally found a glimmer of hope in the front gate. It was a little boy. I saw in him the possibility of reviving the Devil's Doctrine and changing the whole world. However, it was a pity that I killed his father in order to establish my authority after returning to the front gate. Therefore, he did not believe anything I said at all. I brought back so many wonderful skills from the holy land of Buddhism and Taoism, but he refused to learn them. Instead, he insisted on learning the 23-year cicada cultivation that had no hope of success. The old monk recalled the past and shouted angrily, "My only hope was shattered again. What should I do?" Finally, I thought of a way. I wanted to destroy the world, the Devil's Doctrine, Buddhism, and Taoism, and let the world return to peace. However, from the scorched earth, new shoots would grow. Only then could I succeed. Ning Kai looked at the old monk who was almost crazy and suddenly asked, "What do you want the world to become? Or do you want to destroy the world because you can't stand the sight of it?" The old monk gradually restrained his anger and regained his calmness. He said, "You have not even seen what the world looks like. How are you qualified to discuss the transformation of the world with me?" After a moment of silence, Ning Kai said, "Since you have traveled all over the world to find a way to change the world, why did you not go to the academy? I think the academy back then should not be worse than the places you have studied." The old monk said after a long silence, "There is already a guy called Koharan in the academy." Ning Kai stared into his eyes and said, "So it is not to change the world at all. You are just jealous of my youngest uncle. You want to make yourself stronger and defeat him. However, you could not do it. In the end, you fell into despair and wanted the whole world to die with you." The old monk was slightly stunned, and then laughed as if he had heard the funniest thing in the world. He rubbed his shriveled abdomen with his empty hand and said, "Why would I be jealous of a madman?" Ning Ke did not laugh. He looked at him calmly and said, "You are a madman." The old monk was silent, and then sighed softly. He said, "You are right. I am indeed a little jealous. People like me, who cultivate both Taoism and Diabolism, can become a Vedanta in the Xiankong Temple, a divine priest in the Peach Mountain, and the most powerful great priest in the Devil's Doctrine. I don't have the right to be humble. I always thought that I was a peerless figure in 1,000 years, but who would have thought that I would meet a guy who is even more incredible than me?" The old monk sighed and said, "I once learned the lotus imprint of Xiankong Temple and comprehended it on my own as if I was born. I once learned the confinement formation of Peach Mountain and could trap everything in the world with a wave of my fingers. I am proficient in all the skills of the 7 sects and 28 schools of the Devil's Doctrine, and even the practice of Tao Tai that had been lost for a long time. I even read 2 volumes of the Tomes of Arcane and comprehended Haotian's divine will. If it wasn't for the fact that I didn't want to be a dog, I could have Tianqi at any time. Do you think I am a cultivation genius?" Every time Ning Ke heard a sentence, his heart trembled. He thought carefully that he had never seen such a powerful cultivator in his life. Even Master Yen Sei and second brother seemed to be far inferior to him. It seemed that such a person was not a cultivation genius. He said honestly, "You are truly proficient in all techniques. You are indeed an extraordinary person." The old monk laughed at himself and said, "Then do you know how many skills Ko Howren knows?" Ning Ke was silent. The old monk shook his head slowly and said, "He only knows 1. Ning Ke said in surprise, "1?" The old monk said calmly, "Ko Howren only knows how to use a sword. From the wooden sword that looked like children fighting with each other to the sword that broke through the clouds, they were all his Howren sword." Ning Ke looked at the mottled sword marks on the walls around the room and thought in confusion. If youngest uncle only knew how to use the Howren sword, then how could he set up such a powerful confinement formation and trap someone like Lotus for decades? The old monk seemed to have sensed his and Mo Shanshan's doubts and said with a smile, "You said that I am truly proficient in all techniques. Then let me tell you, Ko Howren is truly proficient in 1 technique and all techniques. He only knows how to use a sword in his life, but he can transform the sword style into all the Taoism in the world. The confinement formation in this room is one such example. 1 sword transformed into thousands of Taoism in the world." Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. He wondered how many years it would take for him to reach such a state. The old monk said with a smile, "It is really helpless to meet such a person. Ko Howren is not as good-looking as I am. The stupid donkey that he rides is not as good as my horse. His feet sweat so much that they stink when he takes off his shoes. But he likes to pick his feet when he sits down. He has a bad temper too. He even quarreled with the headmaster for 3 days and 3 nights just for a bowl of braised pork. He is such a person, but the world only looks at him. When I travel with him, the world only looks at him. No matter how many shocking things I do, the world only looks at him." The old monk smiled bitterly and raised his left hand to make a single lotus print in front of his chest. He gently stroked Yi Hongyu's head as if he was spoiling a child and continued, "I want to do earth-shattering things because I am jealous of him. But the main reason is that I want to find a way to the Nirvana realm. No matter what I do, he always stands in front of me. So I have to think of a way to kill him." "But he still saw through your plot," Ning Ke said. The old monk sighed and said, "At that time, Wei Guangming almost saw through me. I had no choice but to hide in the Devil's Doctrine. But I did not expect Ko Howren to see through what happened in the Lank Temple and chase after me. At that time, I did not care much about it. I always thought that by gathering the power of the Devil's Doctrine, I would be able to kill him. I was even happy about his arrival and prepared to welcome his death. Before that, I had never fought with Ko Howren. I knew he was strong, but I always thought that even if he was the strongest in the world, so what? But I did not expect him to be so strong. The old monk said coldly, "He won because he was strong." People in the devil's doctrine can accept this logic. I can accept losing to him. Even if he killed me with a sword, I would not have any complaints. But he should not have spared me. He should not have spared me. The old monk's skinny face suddenly twisted. His deep eyes were like ghost fire, spewing out hatred. His hoarse voice seemed to come from the underworld as he shouted, "He destroyed my lifelong cultivation and threw me into this dark room. He used my favorite confinement to seal all the chi of heaven and earth, and suppressed me like a monster in this place where I can never see the blue sky for the rest of my life. He made me suffer eternal loneliness and despair. Who can endure decades of isolation and loneliness? Do you know the despair of looking at the light outside the temple every day and counting the days but never counting the end? Do you know how terrible the punishment is to only look at these four walls for decades? Do you know that when a person stays alone for a long time, even silence will become the most terrible torture?" The old monk stared at Ning Kei's face with hatred, as if he was looking at the face of that person. His breathing became abnormally rapid because of his agitation, and his voice became more mournful and sorrowful, just like how he felt at that time. "The second place on the weekly list. Please vote for me and feel the first place. Thank you." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 278. Absolute silence, not a single sound. No ants crawled past, no leaves swayed. Nothing at all. In the end, because you wanted to hear sounds too much, your eardrums became extremely sensitive. You could even hear the sounds of the corpses around you rotting. When the sounds of the stomachs of the corpses exploding entered your ears, it was like a clap of thunder. The old monk's shrill voice reverberated in the quiet room, like countless continuous claps of thunder. The corpses in the room had all rotted or turned into dried corpses. As a result, even these sounds were gone. The sounds that made you want to puke a moment ago became the most beautiful memory in the next moment. Do you know this feeling? In the end, you could even hear the sound of your blood flowing in your veins. You could hear the sound of your muscles losing moisture and deforming. You could hear the sound of your stomach shriveling and the sound of your intestines being torn apart. It was amazing, wasn't it? If you listened to it for a long time, you would definitely want to vomit. However, the problem was that you couldn't vomit. The old monk's eyes lost all luster. He was like a stone statue as he recalled the decades of cruel life. He muttered, "No matter how strong a cultivator is, he can't not eat or drink at all. You need to eat something, even if it's something disgusting.
If you vomit it out, you will die."
The old monk suddenly screamed shrilly, "I know this way of living is crueler than death. When I was imprisoned here by Koharan, I should have committed suicide." However, this seemingly straightforward guy had a mind that was more sinister than the devil. He knew that since I was greedy for a moment of life, I would never be willing to die. He was the real devil. Ning Kei asked after a moment of silence, "What did you eat to survive these decades?" On the mountain of bones beneath the old monk, there were old corpses that had been dried by the dry breeze and white skeletons. Ning Kei's gaze fell upon it, and he could not help but frown. Mo Shanshan followed his gaze and found that there were many bone fragments at the foot of the bone corpse mountain. Those bone fragments seemed to be the traces left behind by wild beasts. Suddenly, she understood something. Her body suddenly stiffened, and her face became abnormally pale. Looking at the reactions of the two, the old monk laughed loudly. His laughter was shrill and sharp, like a sorrowful old ghost crying with hatred. The drooping skin on his face wrinkled, as if he was really crying. However, probably because of the severe dehydration in his body, the tear that was squeezed out from the corner of his old eyes was as turbid as stalactite. Looking at the old and cloudy eyes, listening to the heart-wrenching laughter, and thinking of the old monk being imprisoned in the front gate of the devil's doctrine for decades, even the toughest person would feel sad and sympathetic. However, Ning Ke did not feel this way at all. He looked at the old monk and said, "Sympathy is something that cannot be begged for." The old monk's maniacal laughter gradually came to a stop. His eyes, which were like the wisps, stared at Meng Qi's face. Ning Ke tilted his head and looked at the stone wall. After a moment of silence, he said, "Maybe it's because I encountered too many dangers when I was young. I'm a person who lacks a sense of security. I always think about what if something happens to me. Who raised Sang Sang? What if something happened to Sang Sang? How can I convince myself to continue living? If someone did what you did to Sang Sang, I would agonize over how to take revenge. It would be too easy to kill you with one strike. You probably wouldn't be able to hold on for too long, even if I cut off your limbs and put you in a sh*t jar. I can't let you suffer for too long. Naturally, I wouldn't be happy." He retracted his gaze and looked at the old monk. He smiled and praised, "Now that I think about your decades, I realize that youngest uncle is indeed a genius who knows how to use one method and many methods. You are also talented in torturing people. I won't sympathize with you. I will learn this method, and I just hope that I won't have to use it in the future." The old monk did not know who Sang Sang was, but Mo Shanshan did. She glanced at Ning Quebec. The old monk smiled and did not say anything else. The previous series of questions had already slightly eased the resentment that he had accumulated for decades. He now had more important things to do. He slowly lowered his head and gently moved his dry lips to the girl under his palm. Yi Hongyu looked at the old monk coldly. Her naked skin could not help but bulge out in fear. No one could completely dispel the fear in their hearts as they watched themselves being torn into pieces and eaten slowly. Suddenly, a clear sound rang out in the silent and dim room. Ning Ke pulled out the padao on his back and suddenly sprang up on his knees. He was like a tiger that had been hiding in the long grass all night and had finally found the weakness of its prey. He suddenly pounced towards the old monk in the Bone Mountain. In midair, a cold flash of knife light sprayed out like a storm. He and Mo Shanshan had been controlled by the old monk with one glance. Their sense of perception was severely injured, and they could not control any part of their bodies. However, he somehow managed to overcome this obstacle and forcefully control his body. At this moment, the old monk was bent down and ready to chew on Yi Hongyu's flesh. He should not have noticed Ning Ke's movements. It was a great opportunity for a sneak attack. When the old monk saw the flash of knife light from the corner of his eye, Ning Ke's padao was only half a foot away from his neck. No matter how he looked at it, he could no longer prevent death from coming. However, he still saw it from the corner of his eye. When the old monk saw the flash of knife light, his mind moved. Other than the holy light of Haotian, there was nothing in the world faster than his mind. A wave of spiritual power that was not strong but extremely pure emanated from the old monk's eyes. Countless white bones in the Bone Corpse Mountain responded to the aura and flew up. A thick leg bone blocked in front of the snow-white blade light. No one knew which devil's doctrine master left this pure, white leg bone. His soul had long been lost, but his strength was still there. When it collided with the saber radiance, a huge crack appeared on it, but it did not break in the middle. The entire room was filled with the confinement array that youngest uncle had set up years ago. The talisman carved by the two senior brothers on the padao could not absorb any chi of heaven and earth. He could not even face the bone directly controlled by the old monk's psyche power. Ning Ke let out a muffled groan. The huge force from the blade directly broke his wrist. His body flew backward, and he spat out a mouthful of blood in midair. Amidst the bone mountain, the fragments of the white roots that were stimulated by the old monk's psyche power followed closely, hitting his body with crackling sounds like a storm. In an instant, he suffered hundreds and thousands of heavy blows. Fresh blood kept spurting out, and who knew how many bones in his body were broken. With a thud, Ning Ke fell heavily to the ground and spat out another mouthful of blood on his clothes. Fortunately, the storm formed by the white bones fell to the ground after leaving the area of the Bone Mountain and did not attack again. Endless pain came from all parts of his body, as if all his bones were broken. Ning Ke frowned and stabbed the ground with the padao in an attempt to stand up. However, he could not resist the injuries in his body and knelt heavily on the ground on one knee. The old monk's face was pale and his cheeks were sunken. A dim light shone in his eyes and his body swayed slightly. It was obvious that he had paid a huge price to deal with Ning Ke's sneak attack. The power that he had accumulated over the decades and the mouthful of blood had all been used up. However, no matter how weak he was, his palm still held Yi Hongyu tightly. The judgment tactical array that isolated the aura of heaven and earth was the most terrifying existence to cultivators. Because there was no chi of heaven and earth, most Taoist skills could not be used at all. Especially when Master Lotus's gaze contained a supreme state, it could directly injure a cultivator's sense of perception and cause them to be unable to use their consciousness to control their own bodies. A cultivator in such a situation was like a calligrapher who had lost his brush or a musician who had lost his seven-string zither. He only had knowledge, but lost all his abilities and would definitely fall into complete despair. However, Ning Ke was different from most cultivators in the world. He had just learned to cultivate. In the past 10 years, when he was struggling on the edge of life and death, he had never relied on any Taoist skills or flying swords. He had relied on his own body and the 3 blades behind him. Even when his sense of perception was severely damaged by Master Lotus gaze, he did not fall into despair. This was because after countless battles, his control over his body was so strong that it was hard for an ordinary person to imagine. He could even control his body's bones and muscles. During the long conversation earlier, he had been constantly tensing and relaxing his muscles at a high frequency. He wanted his body to truly relax and break away from the control of his sense of perception so that he could respond on his own. It must be said that Ning Ke was indeed a person who was good at fighting. Especially when he was in a seemingly hopeless situation where he was fighting against someone stronger than him, the calmer he was, the stronger his battle awareness became. However, it was a pity that the difference in power between the two of them was so huge that it could not be made up for with just judgment, calculation, and battle awareness. Your control over your body has actually reached such a level. The old monk was slightly surprised as he looked at Ning Ke, who was half kneeling on the ground. His 2 white eyebrows slowly floated up and he said in a low voice, "Even though the desolate man's body is strong, his consciousness and body are actually not as good as yours. I did not expect this generation's world wayfarer of the academy to be such good material for devil's cultivation. What a pity, what a pity." Ning Ke was seriously injured and could no longer hold the hilt in his hands tightly. His body swayed a few times and finally fell to the ground again. He did not clearly hear what the old monk said. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and coughed in pain. Everything happened too quickly, and Mo Shanshan was completely unprepared. Now, she looked at Ning Ke lying in a pool of blood, and her eyes were filled with worry. However, she could not go over to see how he was doing. Ning Ke looked at her expression and slowly moved over with difficulty. He sat with his back facing her and coughed in pain again. He panted and said weakly, "I won't die for now, but I really can't move now." The old monk looked at him, and the more he looked at him, the more he liked him. He said regretfully, "You are so talented. If you are not a disciple of the academy, I would really want to pass my mantle to you and see how far you can go in the future." Ning Ke used to really think that he was a cultivation genius. However, he had gone through a lot of hardships to enter the cultivation world. Once he entered the cultivation world, he had seen too many true powerhouses, second brother Chin Pippi, a freak, and also met genius girls like the calligraphy addict and the Tao addict. It was only then that he gradually gave up on that idea and realized that his talent in cultivation was only mediocre. So when he heard the old monk's lament, he could not help but feel a little strange. He lifted the corner of his lips with difficulty and said self-mockingly while panting, "Only 10 acupoints in the ocean of chi and mountain of snow can be considered a talent." The old monk looked at him and said weakly, "If you are willing to cultivate the devil's way, so what if you know nothing?" Ning Ke leaned weakly on Emo Shanshan's back and looked at the old monk in the Bone Mountain. He smiled with difficulty and said, "Master, I am willing to follow you to cultivate the devil's way. Can you let us go? Why do we have to fight to our deaths?" The old monk looked at him with a compassionate gaze and said weakly, "Why are you joking now?" Ning Ke coughed twice and said while panting, "It's not a joke. I can swear on the headmaster's character." The old monk opened his mouth with difficulty and said with a smile, "Koharan and I have been enemies for a lifetime. I know the true colors of the academy better than anyone else in the world. Others may believe it, but I know that no one from the academy can be trusted." Ning Ke could not help but laugh when he heard this. However, he felt a pain in his chest and started coughing violently again. The old monk looked at him and said in confusion, "You should be able to bear it. Why did you choose that timing to attack? Although that timing was good, it was still a little too early. Wouldn't it be better if you could wait until the moment when I devoured the flesh?" Ning Ke wiped the blood that he coughed out and said, "It was indeed a little too early. It's mainly because I don't like to see you eat human flesh." Hearing the word human flesh, the old monk's expression gradually turned vicious. He said coldly, "I have gnawed on dried bones and meat for decades. In the end, the meat has become dry, wood dregs. Do you think it's delicious?" The old monk looked at the young man and woman who were sitting back to back and said viciously, "The human flesh that I ate when I was traveling in the world was either for planning or to make myself stronger. Do you think I am a psychopathic lunatic who likes to eat human flesh? Do you think that human flesh is really delicious?" The old monk thought of the green robe that drifted through the Devil's Hall decades ago and laughed maniacally. "Koharan sealed me in this isolated hell to force me to eat human flesh. Later on, another guy came here. No matter how I begged him, he refused to let me go or kill me. Instead, he picked up a dozen corpses and threw them to me as food. He said that it was Hao Yan's reward for me. If I am a demon, then what are they?" He looked at Yi Hongyu, who was pursing her lips stubbornly under his palm. She refused to beg for mercy or cry out in pain, and her face was pale. He looked at Ning Ke and said coldly, "This Haotian Taoism girl is the first fresh meat that I have eaten in decades. Compared to her, she tastes much better. Do you want to try?" Ning Ke looked at the old monk's ghostly eyes and said after a moment of silence, "No, I know it doesn't taste good." Emo Shanshan, who was leaning weakly on his back, did not understand what he said. She thought that he was just stating a fact. No one had to taste it to know that human flesh did not taste good. However, the old monk understood his words. A look of surprise appeared on his old face, and the resentment in his eyes instantly turned into compassion and kindness. He sighed with emotion and said, "The Academy is indeed the Academy. I admire you. Please do not hesitate to vote for me. Thank you." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 279. Ning Ke knew why the old monk suddenly praised the academy. It was because the academy dared to accept someone like him, which required an unimaginable breadth of mind and an attitude of tolerance. Such an academy deserved everyone's admiration. He said proudly, "The academy wins in this world." The old monk said mockingly, "But the academy will eventually become a ruin." Ning Ke said, "Everything in the world is like that, but at least the academy will not become a ruin because of your curse." The old monk looked at this young man who was seriously injured but still proud and confident, as if he was looking at his friend from many years ago. After a moment of silence, he suddenly asked, "How many years has it been since Koharan died?" Ning Ke was startled and shook his head. "I don't know. I told him that Haoran's sword had entered the devil's way, but he did not care. I warned him that if he continued to be so proud, he would be punished by Haoyan one day, but he still did not care. Now he must have turned into ashes and scattered across every stream and every mountain in the world. I wonder if he is still so proud now, haha." The old monk lowered his head and laughed like a madman. A turbid old tear squeezed out from the corner of his eye. Ning Ke said, "Youngest uncle should be proud even if he died." The old monk raised his head, looked at him, and said coldly, "But he died in front of me, so I won." Ning Ke said mockingly, "Some people die, but he is still alive. Some people live, but he is already dead." The old monk sighed and said, "What a sharp-tongued young man. Will I succeed next time?" Ning Ke suddenly asked sincerely. His body was still trembling slightly under the cotton clothes. Although this method was very exhausting, it was the only way to maintain mobility under the terrifying mental control of the other party. The old monk looked at him and said sincerely, "There will not be a next time." Ning Ke said, "You are indeed the most powerful existence I can imagine. But you, who have been imprisoned for decades, are just a king who has been reduced to dust. I, who am young and strong, am a fierce tiger who has just come down from the mountain. The confinement's isolation of the chi of heaven and earth does not affect me. I am used to doing things with my strength. There is no reason for you to recover faster than me." The old monk smiled and said, "You are indeed sharp-tongued. Unfortunately, I am so old that I have no teeth." With that, he lowered his head and bit down hard on Yi Hongyu's bare shoulder. Yi Hongyu raised her eyebrows but refused to lower her head. She stubbornly watched as the old monk chewed on her flesh. It was as if she wanted to engrave this scene in her mind and never forget it even in the underworld. The old monk did not have any teeth, so he used his gums to chew. It was extremely difficult, like an old toothless lion trying to tear apart a doe with tough skin and flesh. Blood kept dripping from the corner of his old lips. After a while, the old monk looked up at Ning Ke and said with a smile, "You want to waste time, so do I. After digesting the first bite, the second bite will be absorbed faster. You don't have to struggle anymore. You can calmly welcome death. That will be more joyful. After I reincarnate the three of you into my stomach and recover my power, I will destroy this confinement and leave the mountain. This world will be mine, and it will also be yours." Because of the flesh and blood in his mouth, the old monk's voice was a little muffled, but it was still as warm as spring water. His wrinkled lips and chin were dripping with blood, but his smile seemed to be plated with a layer of Buddha's light. The mountain of bones and the sea of corpses on his body were like a holy lotus seat, overflowing with clear light. Such an image of the Buddha and the devil was extremely terrifying. Ning Ke knew what he said was true. He thought about all the ways to save his life, but could not find a way to break out of the current crisis. Whether it was the bag that Master Yen Sei left for him, the primordial 13 arrows, or the talisman on the Padao, they all needed to be connected with nature to exert their true power. He could not help but think of death in silence. He stared at the old monk and said firmly, "Even if you can get out, this world will not be yours." The old monk recalled the green robe and said with a smile, "I have already connected with Tao and the devil. Why should I be afraid of the laws of the world?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "There is still the headmaster of the academy." The old monk was silent for a moment and said, "The headmaster of the academy will die eventually. People in the academy are too proud, and the more proud they are, the more likely they will die. This is the fate of the headmaster of the academy and the fate of the academy. It cannot be changed." Ning Ke frowned slightly and said, "Crazy words." The old monk suddenly asked, "Who is the empress of the Tang Empire in Chang'an? How many generals in the peak state of martial arts have appeared in recent years? Has the devil dance appeared again? Koharan was punished by heaven. Did the headmaster of the Peach Mountain? Something is not right. This little girl said that she is the Grand Master of the Judicial Department. Has the Divine Hall not been destroyed? When Koharan was punished by heaven and the headmaster of the academy went to the Peach Mountain, he thought that the Divine Hall on the Peach Mountain would naturally be destroyed. Now that he was sure that the West Hill Divine Palace still existed, he could not help but feel confused. He believed that his plan would not have any loopholes. Ning Ke did not know how to answer these questions. It seemed like a crazy question, but there seemed to be a lot of history hidden in it. There were many secrets hidden in the dust. Before the front gate was destroyed, I arranged many things. I arranged for the saintess to go south. I believe that she will do what I asked her to do. I arranged for many disciples to go south. I believe that one of them will do what I asked." The old monk looked at him and smiled. His smile was full of confidence and even dominance. The Enlightenment doctrine was already rotten. I don't feel sorry for it even if it was destroyed by Koharan. I would rather create a new devil's doctrine on top of the ruins. The new devil's doctrine will be rooted in the fertile land of the Tang Empire. Once it is reborn, it will definitely be a new existence. I believe that these arrangements of mine should be gradually working after such a long time. Then I just need to wait quietly for the headmaster of the academy to die. Then who do you think this world will belong to? Ning Ke felt cold all over. He thought to himself, are there countless powerhouses of the devil's doctrine hiding in Chongmen today? And these people all listen to his arrangements to go south? If this person was allowed to escape from the front gate of the devil's doctrine, how much trouble would there be in the world? But you should have thought that youngest uncle would kill you at that time. Once you die, what's the point of hiding so many backups and arrangements in the Central Plains? The old monk looked at him with slight mockery, like the snow on the peak looking at the insects in summer. He said, "Even if I die, these arrangements of the past still exist. You mortals never seem to understand that the meaning of a person's life and death is not important. What's important is whether we can change this old world and usher in a new world. Then, we can gather the power of the new world to change some rules. If I can do this, what can I do even if I die?" Ning Ke asked, "What rules?" The old monk replied, "The rules of Tao." Ning Ke asked, "What if you can't change it even after planning for your whole life?" The old monk replied with a smile, "At least I've tried." Ning Ke frowned and said, "You're willing to let the whole world die just for your attempt." The old monk said calmly, "What does the destruction of the world have to do with me?" This was probably the source of pleasure for a schemer. Ning Ke thought silently in his heart. He was extremely impressed by the old monk's careful planning in this life, but he was also extremely afraid of it. Because a madman was always difficult to defeat. At this moment, the world-famous Master Lotus was a complete madman in Ning Ke's eyes. He could not understand what he was saying at all. Even if he could understand a little, he would not know which words were true and which were false. He could not even determine what kind of person he was. This old monk was sometimes as innocent and pure as a newborn baby, sometimes as mean and hot-tempered as a shrewish woman in the market, sometimes as hot-blooded as a young scholar in the capital, sometimes as heroic as a young swordsman holding a sword to fight against injustice, sometimes as compassionate as a Vedanta of Buddhism, and sometimes as cruel and indifferent as a demon. No matter which image it was incomparably real, and there was not a single trace of falsehood. His various appearances were different, but they all came from his heart. It was so pure that it made one's heart palpitate. It was just like the saying, if you want to become a Buddha, then become a Buddha. If you want to become a demon, then become a demon. They were all true Buddhas and true demons looking at the world with pity or indifference. He was simple but fickle, lonely and weak, complicated and annoying, sometimes jealous and sometimes sinister, fond of competing and occasionally complaining, selfish and boring but perverted and adventurous, fond of sophistry and fantasy, kind and loving but vengeful and tyrannical. He was proud when he was glorious, sad when he was dull, contradictory and hypocritical, joyful but painful, great but insignificant. Note: Lotus had 32 petals, each with different petals. It was hard to imagine that a person's personality and thoughts could be so complicated. Ning Ke thought coldly, could it be that this person actually had 32 personalities? After the old monk finished speaking, he calmly closed his eyes and began to use the secret method of the devil's doctrine, Tao Tai, to digest and absorb the Tao addict's flesh and blood into his primordial qi. Ning Ke's voice echoed in the quiet room, but no one answered him now. These voices seemed monotonous and uneasy, even faintly revealing a sense of despair. There is no devil in the world, but when there are more people like you, there will be a devil. No matter what role you play, you will be a devil. Lotus has 32 petals, each of which is dirty. When Taoism and devil are connected, they will become gods, but they can also become crazy. No matter what Ning Ke said, the old monk in the White Bone Mountain did not respond. He had spent so much effort to come up with these seemingly philosophical words, but they were all wasted in the dry air. He could not anger the other party, and it was even more impossible for the other party to have some loopholes in his mind because of these words. Ning Ke weakly rested his head on Emo Shanshan's shoulder and looked at the blue stones on the roof. He knew that after the old monk had completely digested and absorbed the second mouthful of flesh and blood that was filled with the aura of Haotian Taoism, his state would recover to a level that he could not reach. At that time, there would be no way to change the fate of death. His gaze became a little dim. The light in the room of the Devil's Hall was getting dimmer and dimmer. It was probably nighttime in the world outside the mountain, and the temperature was getting lower. He looked up at the mottled sword marks on the roof and the stone walls. Those were the sword marks left by youngest uncle, the sword marks that formed a confinement that had trapped Lotus 32 for decades. He sighed softly in his heart. It was just a casual glance. He did not deliberately control his state of mind. It was probably because he had become used to using the 8-strokes calligraphy of Yong in the old library. The dense sword marks naturally separated in his vision and gradually became clear. Ning Ke's gaze stayed on those sword marks for a long time. His state of mind followed the marks and gradually developed a certain feeling. This feeling was very obscure, difficult to grasp, and difficult to distinguish, but his body warmed up because of it. Note: the 32 words of Lotus 32 are all from the lyrics of a song, Do Wei's Advanced Animal. Also, I would like to clarify that the main problem with the slow development of the plot is the slow updating. I have been writing seriously and attentively, sleeping in the afternoon and thinking about the manuscript. But the updating is indeed a problem, and I am thinking about how to solve it. Maybe it will explode, or maybe I will not use this name for the time being. Although it is indeed entering the devil, please look forward to it. Also, little Junjun of the high-rise building has started a new book. The book number is 230-8671. The disgusting advertisement is below. Please go and ravage him. Welcome to the country of dragons. Welcome to the world of dragon skills. Come on. Here is the most exciting, most passionate, most hot-blooded, gorgeous chapter. Come on. Let us enter the world of Dragon Soul of heaven and earth together and create a dragon era that belongs to us. To be continued, High-Rise Building's strongest work of the year. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 280. The obscure feeling in his body did not attract much attention from Ning Quebec. He even thought that the warmth came from Emo Shanshan, who was behind him. He just quietly looked at the mottled sword marks on the bluestone roof. He thought of youngest uncle's cool demeanor when he splashed the sword style, and thought of his own helplessness as he waited for death. He felt a little ashamed and embarrassed. It was a sad thing to wait for death in despair. People in such situations would usually remain silent. At this moment, Master Lotus did not speak. Ning Ke naturally did not have the mood to speak as well. The room in the Devil's Hall became dead silent. The absolutely quiet environment was just like what Master Lotus had viciously recalled. It was indeed scary if it lasted for a long time. There was no sound of wind or flowers. Ning Ke could even faintly hear the sound of his own lungs expanding and contracting and the sound of his own hair rubbing against each other. He felt that it was very magical but also very scary. If he could not clearly feel Emo Shanshan's warm and soft body, he might really think that he had arrived at the underworld. Emo Shanshan weakly leaned on his shoulder and asked haggardly, "Are we going to die?" Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "It seems so." Emo Shanshan frowned slightly and said, "Why can't you comfort me?" Ning Ke coughed painfully and said in a self-deprecating manner, If I can die a quick death, it is actually considered a comfort. Mo Shanshan understood what he meant. It would be good if she was directly killed by Master Lotus later. But if she was like Yi Hongyu, who watched helplessly as she was eaten, that would be the greatest fear in the world. Thinking of this, the girl's beautiful face suddenly became extremely pale. Her long and sparse eyelashes trembled slightly, and her thin lips were tightly pressed into a red line. After a long silence, she looked at Ning Kei's deeply furrowed brows because of his coughing and said with a slightly trembling voice, "In the palace, I said that I like your handwriting." Ning Kei did not know why the calligraphy addict would mention this at this time. After a slight pause, he comforted her with a smile and said, "I know that my handwriting is good. If you want to see it, I can go out and write a few thousand words for you to see." Mo Shanshan smiled and said, "I also said that I like your big black horse." Ning Kei was stunned and said with a bitter smile, "That naughty fellow is really reluctant to give it away. I don't want the big black horse." Mo Shanshan gently bit her lower lip and said softly as if she had made up her mind, "I do like your calligraphy and the big black horse, but I want to tell you something else. I like you." This confession directly turned Ning Kei into a block of wood. He looked at the haggard but still beautiful face close to him and smelled the faint scent of the girl close to his nose. He was silent for a long time, thinking about how to answer. This was the first time in his 2 lifetimes that he had been confessed to by a man of the opposite sex. This was one of the most touching words he had heard in both lifetimes. Although it was a pity that it happened in the dark front gate of the Devil's Doctrine and at the moment of death, it was still as pleasant as the sound of willow branches rubbing against each other by the lake. Was that the Ink Lake at the foot of Mogan Mountain? The girl on his shoulder was the best in the world in terms of temperament, appearance, and state of cultivation. Many young men secretly admired her, but did not dare to say anything. In Ning Kei's eyes, Mo Shanshan could not find any fault with her, except that she was easily misunderstood as aloof and cold because of her poor eyesight. In terms of sect, family, or political background, the Tang Empire and the Great River Kingdom had been on good terms for generations. The headmaster of the academy and His Majesty would definitely be happy to see this. They were a good match. In terms of hobbies, the two could be said to be like-minded. If they were really together, they could spend the long night together splashing ink and appreciating each other's works. Wouldn't that be wonderful? The most important thing was, did he like her? Of course he liked her. A man's love was sometimes very complicated, but most of the time it was very simple. A girl like Mo Shanshan, who is worthy of being liked, should naturally be liked. So was Ning Quebec. It was just that he was about to die in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and he still had the mood to think about so many things for so long. When he came to his senses, he could not help but laugh. He always felt that something was wrong. This feeling was very strange. Any background and worldly matters were not important before he died. Moreover, he asked himself if he really liked this girl, who was as pure as ink. However, he became more and more vigilant about the strange feeling in his heart. It was as if he was about to take the crucial step before joining the devil. Behind the great beauty was a great fear. What was that fear? Ning Kei himself did not know. He looked at the girl on his shoulder and said helplessly, "Younger sister Shanshan, I like your temperament and appearance, including the way you do things. Logically speaking, at this time, I should not." Mo Shanshan's face did not have the usual shyness after a girl's confession. She only had a gentle and calm expression. She knew why Ning Kei was hesitating. She knew better than this guy himself why he was hesitating. She could not help but sigh softly in her heart. She gently leaned into his arms and murmured, "You are really muddle-headed in some aspects. I just don't want to die, and you don't know my feelings for you. I'm not in a hurry to hear any comfort from you. At this moment, anything you say doesn't count and isn't fair. I'm just telling you this." Ning Kei wanted to refute that he was muddle-headed. However, he thought that he was indeed muddle-headed at this time. Why couldn't he hold this girl in his arms according to his true feelings and tell her that he liked her too? Then he could make up for the regrets of his 2 lives before he died. What was he afraid of? However, He felt Mo Shanshan's feelings and was touched. He softly said, "Then I know." Mo Shanshan smiled contentedly. She slowly closed her eyes and leaned into his arms. She said, "Then this is enough." In the dark and silent room of the Devil's Palace, in the middle of the hill of bones and corpses, a ghost-like old monk gently pressed his palm on the head of a beautiful girl who was covered in blood. It was as cold as winter. However, in the other corner of the room, a young man and a young woman who were about to meet death were gently hugging each other and whispering like small animals. It was as warm as spring. This bloody and cruel but beautiful scene made people's hearts palpitate and move. Beautiful feelings could not make the world truly beautiful. It seemed warm like spring, but in fact, as the night shrouded the mountain outside the Devil's Doctrine, the light in the room became darker and the temperature dropped. The weak Mo Shanshan leaned into Ning Kei's arms and fainted. Ning Kei, who was severely injured, also felt that the heat in his body was gradually disappearing. He vaguely remembered the previous warmth. He instinctively raised his head and looked at the blue stones on the roof again. He suddenly found that the mottled sword marks on the stones did not disappear with the night, but began to emit a faint flame. Youngest uncle had killed the powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine with his sword. His sword was stained with blood, and then he climbed up the stone wall and, finally, became the ghost fire today. But Ning Kei clearly remembered that ghost fire should be the remains of a rotten corpse, and it should not last for too long. He squinted at the increasingly clear sword marks on the roof and gradually became entranced. Once again, he habitually used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to solve it, completely forgetting the injuries on his body and even forgetting to cough. The mottled sword marks with a faint flame began to decompose into dense light filaments, and then began to circulate in his field of vision. It was as if he was lying on the grassland and looking at the sky full of stars above his head, beautiful and peaceful. Suddenly, Ning Kei felt a trace of warmth in his body. This time, he did not let the feeling pass, nor did he pay too much attention to it. He just carefully experienced and enjoyed it. The sword marks on the roof flowed according to a certain pattern in his field of vision. The warmth seemed to correspond to it and began to circulate in his body, from his wrist to his neck. Wherever it passed, he felt warm and comfortable. At this time, Ning Kei was in a trance and subconsciously chased after the warmth, trying to dispel the coldness in his body. Correspondingly, his eyes also moved slowly on the sword marks, which were gradually imprinted in his sense of perception. Those sword marks entered his eyes, entered his body, and turned into a warm airflow, passing through his wrist and many joints, entering his internal organs, and becoming some kind of substantial existence, indifferently urging him to stand up. The sword style contained in those marks was so proud. How could it allow itself to despair and surrender in the face of death? So, Ning Kei stood up. He looked up at the sword marks on the roof quietly, as if he did not even know that he had stood up. Mo Shanshan woke up from her coma and looked at him standing in front of her in shock and speechlessness, not knowing what had happened. Ning Kei looked up at the sword marks quietly. He did not know how long he had been looking at them. His pupils gradually became darker and darker, but they were so transparent and crystal clear, as if he had seen an endless abyss when he looked inside. With a clang, he slowly pulled out the padao behind him. He looked at the sword mark flying diagonally forward on the roof and took a step forward with his right foot. He looked at the clumsy and straight short sword mark in the corner and heavily bent his left knee. He looked at the soft and round sword mark on the opposite wall, suddenly turning around and chopping with his padao. The blade buzzed and the air between the blades split apart, causing a strong wind to blow in the quiet room. It was unknown when the old monk had woken up and looked over there indifferently. He had used the practice of Tao Tai to suck 2 mouthfuls of the Tao addict's pure flesh and blood. His cheeks had gradually filled out, and the vitality in his skinny body had become extremely vigorous. At this time, Ning Kei was waving his padao in the corner of the room. He focused on the mottled sword marks on the wall and roof, waving the padao in his hand continuously. He did not notice anything else around him, as if he had entered a deep meditation. The old monk sensed that the aura in the sword marks on the surrounding walls was gradually flowing away and then pouring into the young man's body. His indifferent eyes suddenly became fanatical and venomous. He screamed shrilly, "You are already dead. Do you want the broken sword you left behind to come back to life?" The old monk's cheeks, which had just become a little more plump, suddenly sank. His right hand, which was like a ghost's claw, pointed at Ning Ke, who was still in a daze. It looked like he wanted to kill Ning Ke at the cost of his essence and blood. Mo Shanshan was the first to react. She forcefully supported her weak body and reached behind her to hold a few hard objects tightly. Yi Hongyu, who had been silent under the old monk's withered palm, suddenly raised her head. Her hands, which were supporting herself on the broken bones, trembled slightly. Her cold eyes were filled with a sense of self-abandonment. There will be an important chapter later. Please read it and give your comments. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 281. Before she lifted her head, Yi Hongyu glanced at Ning Ke without any emotions in her eyes. At that time, Ning Ke was holding a long padao and waving it along the sword marks on the walls and ceiling. He was in a daze, and was in a daze. He felt awkward and clumsy when he used his padao as a sword. He looked like a muddle-headed idiot. Yi Hongyu saw that he was seriously injured by Divine Lord Lotus. He should have been lying on the ground, but now he was waving his padao. She did not know what had happened to him, but she could vaguely guess that he had encountered an opportunity and was in the process of enlightenment. The hopeless situation finally showed a small gap with Ning Ke's opportunity. She knew that Divine Lord Lotus would not give Ning Ke any chance, but she had to grab hold of this last chance. So she started to sob. Accompanied by her sobs, the tattered but still bright red dress on her suddenly lost all its color and became pale, as if all the breath of life and blood had been sucked away. Her pale face became abnormally bright red, and the corners of her eyes and nose were blood-red like flowers. She was incomparably charming. 2 streaks of blood-red tears flowed down from the corners of her eyes, and the black hair that draped over her back suddenly rose and danced wildly in the air. Her state, which had been suppressed by the confinement array and Divine Lord Lotus' powerful psyche, had somehow returned to her body. The dark room was filled with the aura of a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. The knowing destiny state only appeared for a very short moment, and then it rapidly dimmed. Like a weed that was pressed down by a stone mountain, it only had time to push away the stone and look up at the clear blue sky before it was pressed back down pitifully. The state had suddenly returned and disappeared, but it did not end there. The collapse of the knowing destiny state in her body was not because the aura of the state was suppressed, but because the state itself was moving downwards. It went all the way down and broke through the lower end of the state. Her cultivation state had returned to the see-through state. She had clearly entered the knowing destiny state. How could she force herself to return to the see-through state? Cultivation in the world had always been about climbing up step by step. Who would turn around and go down the mountain? Even if there were lunatics who were willing to lower their state, how could they do it? You are already taller than the short willow next to the girls' dormitory in the Revelation Institute. You can already jump over 2 stones in the lake that are far apart. How can you be lower than the willow and not be able to step on the stone in front of you? No one could understand what was happening right now. Why would Yi Hongyu do this? She had gone through a lot of hardships to find the most suitable opportunity to enter the knowing destiny state. Why did she return to the see-through state in such an obviously dangerous way? What did she want to do? Then something incredible happened. Yi Hongyu raised her head and stared at Divine Lord Lotus. Her cold eyes were filled with determination and determination. The red dress on her body suddenly turned pale, and her state dropped to the see-through state. A majestic and powerful aura surged from her body and broke through the mind control from the palm above her head. It charged towards the old monk's body. One state would never drop naturally. It was rare to hear of any cultivator who could drop their state by themselves. However, Master Lotus was well-versed in Taoism and Devil's Law. He knew what Yi Hongyu was trying to do when the aura on her body changed. The West Hill Divine Palace had a powerful Taoist law. This Taoist law could allow cultivators to drop their state by themselves. Once this Taoist law was used, the aura that the cultivator had comprehended from the upper state would be released in an instant. The powerful psyche that had been accumulated through decades of hard work and meditation would form a terrifying impact once it was released. However, the price to pay for this Taoist law was too high. The state that the cultivator had gone through a lot of hardships to comprehend was even more important than their lives and families. Who would be willing to give it up and start from scratch? Furthermore, after using this Taoist law, it would be many times more difficult for a cultivator to re-enter the original state than when they first broke through the state. To the powerhouses of the Divine Hall who were qualified to come into contact with this Taoist law, no one would be willing to use this Taoist law on the long road of cultivation. This was more painful and sadder than asking them to die. The powerhouses of the Divine Hall who used this Taoist law would definitely fall into a situation that was more terrifying than death. It required great courage and determination. Note: Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, was already a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. She was undoubtedly the most powerful person in the younger generation in the world. However, at this moment, she did not hesitate to force her state to drop from the knowing destiny state to the see-through state. She did not care about the price and reputation she had to pay, because she was in a situation that was more terrifying than death and colder than the underworld. She saw a glimmer of hope, so she did not hesitate to use death to fight for this chance. In this cold room without a trace of qi of heaven and earth, what else could she do other than burning her own state? The gap between the knowing destiny state and the see-through state was the storm-like aura that surged from her body. It was the distance of half a foot between the old monk's palm and her head. The storm-like aura suddenly approached him. The old monk's body shook slightly, and the finger that was pointing at Ning Ke trembled. He looked indifferent and looked down at the girl who was looking at him stubbornly. There was no human emotion in his deep eyes. He did not expect Yi Hongyu to know such supreme Taoism skills at such a young age. If he knew that this girl from Haotian Taoism was also known as the Tao addict, he would not be so shocked. His dry lips were chanting a spell, and his right hand formed a single lotus mudra in the air. A holy light lit up between his fingers like a candle, and the divine breath of the Tao and the devil instantly occupied the entire white bone mountain. With the forceful suppression of the divine skill, the old monk's skinny palm slowly pressed down on the top of Yi Hongyu's head. Inch by inch, it seemed slow but unstoppable. Yi Hongyu did not lower her head. She stared coldly into the old monk's eyes and bit her lips tightly. She blasted out all the power that she had obtained when she descended to the state, trying to stop the skinny palm from descending. She used both her hands to support herself on the ground. A few broken bones had already pierced deep into her palms. The pain made her even more clear-headed and stubborn. Her slender wrists trembled violently and looked like they could break at any time. However, she stubbornly supported her body. Her body was also trembling violently, as if she could collapse at any time. However, she stubbornly refused to collapse. The two terrifying forces inside and outside of her body clashed and pressed against each other. Blood slowly seeped out from the tiny pores on her delicate face. Then, it condensed into tiny beads of blood and finally dripped onto her pale dress that had lost its original color. However, the skinny palm continued to descend mercilessly and slowly. Inch by inch, even though she had paid such a huge price and even burned up all her life energy, her state was too far away from the divine Lord Lotus, and she still could not stop it. At the last moment, Yi Hongyu glanced at Ning Ke emotionlessly. At this moment, Ning Ke was still holding the padao and comparing it to the Haoran sword mark on the stone wall. Sometimes he danced and sometimes he hugged the padao and was deep in thought. His mind was elsewhere, and he did not know what was happening. I have tried my best. If you still do not wake up, I have no other way. Yi Hongyu looked at Ning Quebec. Her eyes that were bloodshot and looked even more enchanting were filled with a strong sense of despair. She thought, you idiot! When are you going to wake up? Then she closed her eyes. The skinny palm finally landed on top of her head. The old monk looked at the young girl under his palm with a solemn and complicated expression. His previously plump cheeks had already sunk in, and the skinny man had returned to being a ghost. He snorted softly and channeled all the mental strength that he had accumulated for decades into her. A strong aura shot out from the edge of the skinny palm. The dancing black hair returned to Yi Hongyu's shoulders gently and quietly. She slowly fell to the ground, and 2 streaks of red tears flowed from the corner of her eyes. However, she still looked at the old monk's face coldly and stubbornly. The old monk's face was slightly pale, and his body swayed slightly. In order to completely subdue Yi Hongyu, who had burned up her life energy, it was obvious that he had paid a huge price. Things did not end there. What made the old monk feel slightly uneasy and vigilant was not the young girl under his palm, but Ning Ke, who was wielding his knife and sword. That was because the sword he was wielding was the Howren sword. He raised his skinny palm again and pointed at Ning Ke, who was immersed in the sword style and unaware of what was happening around him. Even when Yi Hongyu had displayed such a terrifying Taoist law previously, Lotus still did not exhaust all of his power. That was because he had to reserve enough power to ensure that he could kill Ning Ke before he finished comprehending his swordsmanship. He had to kill Ning Ke with absolute certainty. He could not leave behind any hidden dangers or possibilities. That was why he did not casually glance at Ning Ke this time. Instead, he looked solemn and focused as he pierced his finger through the air. Where his finger pointed, the strong mental strength condensed into something that seemed to be real. It pierced through the silent space and the cold air and pierced straight at Ning Ke's back. At this moment, Ning Ke was holding onto his padao and staring blankly at the sword mark on the stone wall in front of him. His state of mind was empty and dull. He was like an ignorant child watching ants moving house and did not know that there was a stone flying behind him. The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, had already fallen into a pool of blood. She had lost all her strength and was completely defenseless at this moment. In the face of Master Lotus's vicious and serious finger, it seemed that nothing could save her life. At this moment, a white bone flew up and stopped in front of Master Lotus's mental strength. Even if it was the hard remains of the powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine, it should not be able to withstand Master Lotus' boundless and strong mental strength. That was because how could a tangible object resist an intangible mental strength? However, the dim light in the silent room suddenly bent at that moment. The phosphorescence in the sword mark on the walls and ceiling seemed to be disturbed by an invisible force and floated up at the same time. Although the mental strength was intangible, it still had a sense. At this moment, even the light was disturbed and forced to bend, let alone the mental strength. With a swish, Master Lotus's finger pierced through the air. Ning Ke was still standing blankly with his knife. 2 white eyebrows slowly floated up, and the old monk looked at the corner of the room in surprise. That was a forgotten corner. There was a forgotten young girl in the corner. From the beginning until now, this young girl had not displayed any amazing state or abilities. She was extremely weak, so Master Lotus did not pay enough attention to her and even forgot her in the corner. But she was Mo Shanshan. Mo Shanshan of Mogan Mountain. She was the calligraphy addict who was as famous as the Tao addict. Therefore, no matter how weak she was, as long as she could still move, she could do things that ordinary people could not do. The old monk looked at Mo Shanshan indifferently and ignored her. He directly pierced through the air towards Ning Quebec. Mo Shanshan lowered her head and sat cross-legged on the ground. She was so weak that she could collapse at any time. Her right hand took out a stone from behind her and seemed to throw it away casually. However, it blocked the power of the finger. The old monk frowned slightly and raised his skinny little finger. The the psyche power between his fingers pierced through her heart. Mo Shanshan's fingers moved slightly, and a handful of scattered white bone pieces flew in front of her. Then, she lowered her head and coughed painfully. Blood soaked the front of her cotton robe. After calculating the front gate hidden tactical array by the lake for a few days and helping Ning Ke to break the remnants of the Devil's Doctrine's front gate tactical array, the young talisman master's psyche power was on the verge of drying up. Previously, her sense of perception had been severely injured by Master Lotus. But now, she supported herself strongly and used everything around her to set up an array in an attempt to stop Master Lotus. Those white bone pieces were not talismans, but arrays. Most of the arrays in the world were talismans that could change shape. They needed to sense heaven and earth and mobilize the aura of nature. At this moment, because of the suppression of the confinement tactical array, no chi of heaven and earth could be sensed in the dark room. Therefore, the array that she was setting up now was different from ordinary arrays. When that great person modified and realized this array 1,000 years ago, the original intention was not to be close to heaven and earth, but to compete with heaven and earth. Therefore, this array was not originally used to mobilize the chi of heaven and earth. Instead, it was used to cut the chi of heaven and earth, or even to cut and block heaven and earth itself. At this moment, there was no chi of heaven and earth in the room, so this array could not cut and block the chi of heaven and earth. However, it could cut and block any other invisible force, such as the psyche that Master Lotus had cultivated with 2 mouthfuls of blood and 10 years of imprisonment. This array was called Stone Array Tactics. At this moment, the dozens of white bones that were lying between the old monk and Ning Ke were what Mo Shanshan had comprehended when she was outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Although it could not be compared to the real Stone Array Tactics, it was powerful enough. Master Lotus's expression became more and more solemn. He felt a strong sense of uneasiness and the shadow hidden in the rotation of fate. That young man had comprehended the Howren sword style that was left behind by Koharan. That young girl from the Taoism sect could actually perform such a powerful and fierce Taoist art of lowering one's state. And this girl who looked weak and harmless could actually comprehend the Stone Array Tactics. The old monk's skinny palm was like a lotus flower. The jade petals bloomed, and every petal was an extremely powerful psyche power attack. The girl picked up the white bone pieces and the stones that fell from the wall, and continuously repaired the array that she had just comprehended. Ning Ke was in the simple array that was formed by the white bones and stones. He held his knife and meditated. In the serene hall, the sound of something breaking through the air could be heard. The old monk was expressionless, and his eyes were as deep as the netherworld. Fresh blood flowed down from Mo Shanshan's thin lips like a stream, soaking the thick white cotton jacket on her body. Her long and sparse eyelashes trembled slightly on her pale face, as if she could close her eyes at any time. In the pool of blood and scattered bones, Yi Hongyu stared at the old monk's old face. Her eyes were burning with excitement, and her seductive face that was dripping with blood looked weak and crazy. She laughed weirdly and said, "Old monster, continue sucking. Before my blood is sucked dry by you, I want to see who is faster, you or him. I want to see who will survive." Note: about lowering one's state, it can be roughly understood using electronic transition. This is today's first chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qijian.
Calm and vote for me.
Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 282. Master Lotus looked at her indifferently and suddenly smiled. He lowered his head gently and sucked the blood off her delicate cheeks as if he was sucking the dew off a lotus. Then he bit off another piece of her flesh. Yi Hongyu's eyes were filled with pain, but she laughed crazily. "You are afraid." Master Lotus ignored her and chewed the third mouthful of blood calmly. He tried to recover his spirit and vitality in the shortest time possible, at least before Ning Ke woke up. In the world decades ago, He was the most terrifying and powerful figure. Today, facing him, three of the most outstanding people of the younger generation in the world had exploded at the same time. They had finally found a glimmer of hope in the midst of despair. They had fought for a chance of survival in the face of death. The strong confidence and perseverance contained in this dangerous process made even Master Lotus, who had seen countless earth-shattering events in his life, palpitate. He had to show his respect by being serious. The key point of the current situation was that when the calligraphy addict risked the collapse of her sense of perception to forcefully build the stone array formation to block Master Lotus's psyche power attack, would Master Lotus use the practice of Tao Tai to recover his strength first, or would Ning Ke first comprehend the Howren sword style and wake up from the muddled state? Ning Ke did not know that the situation was so dangerous. He did not know what kind of sacrifice and effort the calligraphy addict and Tao addict had made in order to prevent Lotus from interrupting his inexplicable state of cultivation. He did not know what he was doing. He did not know why he felt close to the sword marks and flames. His body, and even the aura in his body, subconsciously followed the direction of the sword marks. He even forgot everything that had happened previously and the world outside of himself. This state was very dangerous. It was like a naked baby walking in the dangerous wilderness without any weapons and could be injured and eaten by wild beasts at any time. But it was also because this state was full of innocence, clean and transparent, without a speck of dust, that it could sincerely accept the projection of the outside world on its mind. This state was called emptiness. Ning Ke felt very good and powerful in the emptiness state. In front of him was only the stone wall, the roof, and the four walls of the green stone wall. The mottled sword marks on the stone wall seemed to have come to life, entering his soul through his eyes and evolving into countless things. Like the stars moving in the night sky, like the stream jumping in the valley, like the clouds floating in the blue sky, like the mountains standing proudly in the world, like a traveler walking happily on the road. Those sword marks started to flow, forming traces, like a book gradually turning its pages. On each page, there were clear diagrams. Those diagrams seemed to be some kind of magical footwork, some kind of powerful sword technique, and some kind of magical cultivation technique. But at the same time, they were nothing, just some kind of meaning, some kind of attitude. He followed the sword mark in his eyes and began to imitate walking. He began to wield the knife like a sword, began to think silently, and began to savor it with a smile. His steps became smoother and smoother, and the padao he held became more and more fluid. Vaguely, he comprehended something on a deeper level. The sword marks that youngest martial uncle left on the bluestone wall were actually just to express some kind of emotion. His steps became smoother and smoother, and his saber swings became smoother and smoother. In the end, he felt carefree. If a traveler wanted to see more of the world and forget the fatigue and pain of the journey, he should dance and sing as he walked. The mountain stood alone in the world, and had to ignore the worship of the common people to be free, so they should be proud and awe-inspiring. The clouds stopped or floated in the blue sky because they were following the direction of the wind. The stream flowed down the valley and had to treat every collision with the stone as a game. It rushed down briskly with the attraction of the earth, creating countless beautiful splashes. This was called jumping. The stars in the night sky were either still or moving, and just smiled at the world according to their own thoughts. Everything was as it should be. This was a carefree feeling that was called as it should be. Because it should be, even if thousands of people were in front of me, I would go when I wanted to. I had a great spirit, so I should be free to go. This was the truth between the heaven and the earth. In his badly damaged sense of perception, the psyche power that he had obtained from meditation for more than 10 years began to flow slowly like the clouds, the stars, and the stream. It began to be as still as a mountain, and began to be as cheerful as a traveler. The sword style contained in the mottled sword marks on the stone wall floated along with the faint phosphorescence and gradually penetrated into his body. As his mind was enlightened, the sword style sped up and then began to flow with the psyche power, stopping and jumping. He did not know what kind of existence these sword styles were. After entering his body, they turned into a warm flow, and repaired his sense of perception in a very short time. Then they continued to pierce his snow mountain and ocean of qi from between his eyebrows. The feeling of his sense of perception being repaired and moisturized was very good. Ning Ke stood in front of the stone wall with a knife in his hand, unaware of everything outside. But his eyebrows unconsciously stretched and then suddenly tightened, feeling a very strong pain in his chest and abdomen. The sword style in the mottled sword marks raged in his body, as if it had turned into thousands of real small swords rampaging, cutting the meridians and viscera invisible to the naked eye until they were dripping with blood and poking thousands of holes. This was more terrifying than the Tao addict's tens of thousands of Taoist swords by the Daming Lake. Then the thousands of small swords flew to the snow mountain in his waist and abdomen and began to hit it constantly. The sharp edges easily cut off the hard ice between the snow-capped peak, and countless snowflakes burst out. The speed of the sword style hitting the snow mountain was getting faster and faster, and in the blink of an eye, it had completed millions of cuts. The cutting of the swords and the ice gradually accumulated a terrible high temperature, and the snow mountain, which had been frozen for countless years, began to melt into water and converged upward into the ocean of qi. Thousands of small swords flew up again in his body or consciousness and flew to the calm ocean of qi. Still like hitting the snow mountain, they began to silently and attentively cut hundreds of millions of times. The calm ocean of qi began to roll, stirring up huge waves, as if it was boiling, and finally it began to boil into a mist that covered the sky. The snow mountain and ocean of qi melted and evaporated into mist, and slowly moved forward in his body according to some kind of channel. Every time it met a certain place, some mist would be left behind, and then condensed into dew and began to moisten it. With the constant moistening of the dew condensed by the mist, those body parts began to decompose and reconstruct, just like an old house being dismantled and then rebuilt. But the rebuilt house was so beautiful, so strong, and supported by the pillars, that it was not afraid of rain and wind at all. Ning Ke felt that as the warmth flowed through his body, there seemed to be innumerable strength re-pouring into his muscles and bones. This feeling was very comfortable, good and powerful, and intoxicating and unwilling to wake up. The sword marks on the mottled stone walls were still moving slowly, and the sword style in the deep sword marks was still entering his body, turning into countless small swords that kept bombarding the snow mountain and ocean of qi, nourishing and strengthening his body. Time passed minute by minute. Ning Ke, who was in pain and intoxication, suddenly felt a shadow in his heart. Even though he was in a state of emptiness, he felt that his body had become cold, because he suddenly thought of something and began to have a great fear. If he allowed this majestic sword style to continue, wouldn't his snow mountain and ocean of qi be pierced through? If the qi openings that he had painstakingly opened disappeared, would he still be able to cultivate? Because of fear, because of uneasiness, he suddenly woke up. He looked at the mottled sword marks on the wall uneasily. He was covered in cold sweat, and the place between his palm and the hilt of the sword was cold and slippery. These sword marks, these sword styles, were youngest uncle's Howren sword. He finally understood what Master Lotus meant by that. Cultivating the Howren sword depended on the Great Spirit in one's chest. In order to cultivate the Great Spirit, one had to betray Haotian and even become enemies with Haotian. To be enemies with Haotian, one would be a devil. And the moment youngest uncle held this sword, he had already become a devil. That was why youngest uncle was finally punished by heaven and died. He had already understood the Howren sword style, and if he accepted the sword style into his body as qi, he would inherit youngest uncle's legacy. And he would become a devil. Continuing youngest uncle's legacy was an honorable and proud thing. However, it was also the most dangerous thing in the world. Even a peerless figure like youngest uncle could not escape the fate of being destroyed once he became a devil. If he learned the Howren sword, how many more days could he live in this world? Ning Ke looked around in confusion. In the Bone Mountain, the old monk was silently cultivating the devil's skill. Yi Hongyu was unconscious under him. Seeing that he had finally woken up, Emo Shanshan smiled with difficulty. She could no longer support her body and fainted on the ground. Night had already covered the world outside the mountain, and the room was extremely dark. He stood in front of the bone mountain with his sword. His clothes were drenched in cold sweat, and he did not know how to move forward. The sword marks on the mottled stone wall stopped flowing, and he waited silently. The sword style in his body stopped flowing, and he waited silently. His will was also waiting silently for the final decision. Once he became a devil, even someone like Lotus could only hide in the dark. If he wanted to walk proudly in the world like youngest uncle, no matter what state he cultivated to, he would still be punished by heaven and die. Ning Ke looked up at the sky, but he could not see anything. He could only see the cold stone wall and the color of the night. For a cultivator, this was the most difficult decision. Their reverence for Haotian would make them not dare to touch that dark world. Even cultivators who did not have the slightest reverence for Haotian would struggle due to the terrifying consideration of life and death. They would probably think hard for half their lives and still not come to a final conclusion. It seemed that he had been thinking and struggling for a lifetime. In fact, he had only thought for a short time when 30 green onions fell from his small palm onto the fried egg noodles. He wanted to live. He wanted to live with someone. That was the most important thing. Compared to him, Haotian was just a pile of shit.
Shit.
Ning Ke raised his padao until it was level with his eyebrows. This was the last time he prayed to heaven. Then the padao fell. The blade fell on the stone wall. It fell on the sword marks left by youngest uncle. He turned his wrist and moved the blade. Following the two sword marks, he moved to the left and then to the right. Phosphorescence danced under the blade, like stars leaving the night sky. With this simple action, the sword style that had been waiting silently suddenly rose. Countless small swords condensed together and came down from the ocean of Qi, splitting the snow mountain. At this moment, Ning Ke knew that he had entered a new world. The psyche power in his sense of perception was still there, but it was no longer playing the zither to the heaven and earth. Instead, it created a beautiful new world in his body. There were trees, lakes, mountains, and seas in that world, waiting for life to flourish here. There was an additional passage between the snow mountain and the ocean of Qi. It seemed that the passage had always existed, but it was blocked and could not be seen. At this moment, it finally showed its true appearance. The majestic sword style turned into some kind of substantial aura and whistled through the passage. It was vast and boundless, rushing straight into the sky. It was so fast. It was the Great Spirit. A slight sound of airflow was heard. Dust and debris splashed out from Ning Ke's body. His eyes were crystal clear, and then they slowly became normal. The second chapter, there's still an ending to this big plot. But these are all the drafts. They will all be released today. I am happy and sad at the same time. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 283. By the Hulun Sea, the cold snow covered the yellow grass, and the lake gradually froze. The grassland man was seizing the last moment to catch fish. The middle-aged man wearing the felt hat looked at the scene on the lake in silence. A pale beard gradually grew on his square and stiff cheeks, making him look even more valiant. A subordinate stood behind him with a respectful expression. The caravan from the Central Plains had been here for quite some time. The tribe's headmen did not know what they were waiting for. If they were waiting for the furs to be delivered at the end of summer, it would be a little too early. But seeing that the caravan had given them enough money and goods, no one paid any attention to them. The subordinate looked at the ice and snow on the lake and whispered hesitantly, "Will the tomes of Arcane really appear here?" After a moment of silence, the middle-aged man said, "When the great divine priest of Revelation returned from the south, he released the news that the tomes of Arcane appeared in the wilderness. He must have received confirmation from the Abbey Dean. I heard that Li Qingshan and Huang Yang once calculated in the Wanyan Tower that the tomes of Arcane would appear by the Hulun Sea. It should not be wrong. The subordinate frowned and said after a moment of thought, Your Excellency, I should not have questioned it. I just feel that it is a little risky to pin all our hopes on the edict issued by the great divine priest of Revelation. After a pause, he said softly, We can't keep the news from Tiang City. If the imperial court knows that you left the general's mansion without permission and a few days ago, there was confirmation that Lin Ling was indeed dead. The middle-aged man looked at the strategist who had been loyal to him for the past 20 years and thought of his equally loyal subordinate who was already dead. He stroked the hair on his temples and said slowly, We'll deal with those things in the future. The current situation is complicated. We can only break out of this predicament by obtaining the tomes of arcane. Compared to that, everything else is irrelevant. He looked at the vast mountains in the north across the lake and said expressionlessly, I believe the great divine priest of Revelation because there are few people in the world who know that the passage out of the front gate is at the Hulun Sea. The counselor frowned and asked, Why not enter the front gate to find the tomes of arcane? Even if many forces are paying attention, there are very few people who have the ability to enter the front gate. It is better to wait for the opportunity than to wait passively. The middle-aged man looked at the distant north in silence and did not answer the question. Mr. Ke did not take the tomes of arcane away, so the tomes of arcane should still be in the sacred ground. He didn't want to return to the mountain gate. Instead, he waited silently by the lake for an opportunity to snatch it. Apart from strategic considerations, it was mostly because of the fear in his heart. At that time, he wasn't very old, but he could already clearly remember those bloody scenes, as well as that ruthless teacher who had a myriad of incarnations. The counselor looked at the middle-aged man's thoughtful expression and thought silently, I wonder what His Excellency will do after obtaining the tomes of arcane. Will he offer it to His Majesty, the Divine Hall, or keep it for himself? Could a scroll of the heavenly book really change everything? Over the past 20 years, the strategist had followed his lord to struggle for survival. He seemed to have woven an extremely dense net, but in the end, this net had bound him, gradually making it difficult for him to breathe. When he thought of this, he could not help but sigh sadly in his heart. The middle-aged man calmly gazed into the distance on the other side of the lake, once again thinking of his deceased teacher. All these years, he, who was born in the Enlightenment doctrine, had struggled to survive between the Empire and the West Hill Divine Palace in order to protect himself and his sister, who was hidden in the Chang and Imperial Palace. Back then, his teacher had traveled among the various forces in the world, but he was like a fish swimming in the lake. He was extremely comfortable and even exuded a sense of happiness. How did he do it? Rough fingers slowly stroked the stone platform, and the animal skin gently trembled in the wind. Standing in front of the bottomless abyss, Tang looked at the giant horizontal stone beams in front of him. He recalled the appearance of the Holy Land that his teacher had described in the past. It corresponded with the increasingly desolate world in front of him because of its grandeur.
He was silent for a long time.
He slowly walked to the edge of the cliff and looked at the endless dark abyss. He silently thought that Haotian Taoism had its reasons for being able to lead the Central Plains for 1,000 years. It should not be underestimated, especially since the Taoist of the Jishou Abbey must really have the ability to fight against the heavens. Since they place so much importance on this matter, the tomes of the heavenly book must have been left in the front gate. But why hadn't they found it? He looked at the hall full of white bones not far away from his feet and suddenly said, according to the teacher, when Mr. Ke broke into the Holy Land with his sword, he did not kill everyone in the front gate. Before the teacher left, he confirmed that many of the disciples had also left. Other than the seniors who died in the battle, many of these white bones were people who committed suicide, and then the front gate was sealed. Tang shouting opened her bright eyes and looked at the hall under the stone beam. She had already passed by that place, but she did not find anything. She curiously asked, Where did those guys go? A gust of wind swept past the stone beam, blowing up bits of gravel and clothes. Tang felt the aura of heaven and earth in the front gate in the wind. After a moment of silence, he calmly said, I can't feel it. They should have left. After saying this, the brother and sister walked into the depths of the front gate. Tang's thick eyebrows slowly furrowed. There were many things that he could not see through in the past. There were also many things that he could not see through in this search for the tomes of the heavenly book. For example, he was sure that those people had left the front gate, but why did he still feel a little uneasy? Decades ago, Kaharan had personally set up the confinement and directly turned this room into a world that was isolated from the rest of the world. As long as one did not step in personally, one would be able to discover the existence of this world. But if one really stepped into this world, one would never be able to walk out again. This was because this world was the hell that he had personally given to Lotus. Haha, woo-woo. You actually learned the Howran sword. In the middle of the room, on the mountain of white bones, Master Lotus looked at Ning Ke and opened his toothless mouth to laugh like a child. Then, his lips pursed, and he began to cry like a child. His laughter and crying mixed together, and it was extremely hoarse and unpleasant. Ning Ke held the padao and looked at him as he replied, "Yes." The old monk's gaze was as cold as ghost fire. He stared at his face and said faintly, "This can't happen." Ning Ke said, "It just happened." The old monk's next sentence came extremely quickly. He shouted like thunder, "Then aren't you being possessed by the devil?" Ning Ke's face was still expressionless as he replied calmly, "Yes." The old monk asked sternly, "Aren't you afraid?" Ning Ke replied, "In the face of death, I am not afraid of anything else." The old monk said mockingly, "But you are still possessed by the devil." Ning Ke frowned and said, "So?" The old monk screamed sternly, "Those who are possessed by the devil must die." Ning Ke said, "But you are still alive." The old monk shook his head slowly and said with slight mockery, "These are two completely different choices. In fact, the Enlightenment doctrine is just a moss-covered stone that hides in the dark to avoid Haotian's divine light. Even though we say that we do not respect Haotian, we are actually extremely afraid of Haotian's existence. That is why Haotian allows us to exist, even as a contrast to the light. However, when you pick up the sword left behind by that person, you will lose all respect and even fear Haotian. This is the true devil's path. Haotian will not allow people like you to exist." Ning Ke was silent for a moment before he replied, "As long as I am alive, it is better than being dead." The old monk was stunned, and then he laughed crazily. Turbid tears slowly flowed from the corners of his old and withered eyes. He pointed at Ning Ke's face with a trembling finger and suppressed his desire to laugh with difficulty. He panted and said viciously, "Madman Ke died after being possessed by the devil, and you are going to follow in his footsteps. I really don't know if the academy is a place cursed by God. You will all be destroyed by Haotian one by one. This is probably your fate." He stared into Ning Ke's eyes and panted as he said, "You have to be strong enough to walk on this path. The faster you become stronger, the faster you will die. Don't think that you can escape from this fate." The old monk asked faintly, "Has God ever spared anyone?" Ning Ke was silent. His hands slowly gripped the hilt of the knife tightly, as if he was prepared to slash at his fate. Then, his reply rang in the dark and silent room. "If man wants to defeat God, why would God spare him?" This calm and proud reply moved Master Lotus slightly. He looked at Ning Ke quietly and suddenly said, "The space in front of a cultivator is definitely his own world." Ning Ke had heard of this saying before, but he did not know why the old monk would say this now. The old monk looked at him and said slowly, "You have comprehended the Howran sword. The sword style that Madman Ke hid in the mottled sword mark has entered your body. Then, the confinement that covered the sky and earth will naturally no longer exist." Ning Ke looked at him and said, "I know. I can even feel the chi of heaven and earth seeping into the room. However, I also need time to adapt to this new aura in my body." The old monk sighed and said, "Even at this point, you and I are still wasting time." Ning Ke said calmly, "Time is fair to everyone." The old monk smiled and said, "My time is up." Ning Ke said, My time is also up. As soon as he finished speaking, the old monk slowly raised his skinny arms. His tattered robes fluttered in the wind that came from an unknown place. With this simple movement, countless auras of heaven and earth seeped into the room through the cracks in the stone walls. Then, they turned into wisps of wind that surrounded his body. Ning Ke had absorbed most of the Haoran sword style that Kahaoran had left in the sword mark to transform his body and open up the snow mountain and ocean of Qi. Without the sword style, the sword mark only had the form and no spirit. Naturally, it could no longer support the confinement. Even though there were still remnants of the Haoran sword style in the stone walls, it could no longer stop the old monk from connecting with heaven and earth. At this moment, the Great Blockage Formation outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine sensed the sudden fluctuation of the qi of heaven and earth. The mossy sword marks on the craggy stones suddenly glowed with a dazzling light. The snow-capped peak reflected the starlight under the night sky. As the qi of heaven and earth rapidly poured into the front gate, it drove the stagnant aura between the stones and even caused the starlight to flow. The fresh aura of heaven and earth that was full of vitality finally passed through the broken confinement and came to the hall that had not been here for decades. Then, it poured into the old monk's skinny body like a flood. The old monk's sunken eyes suddenly shone brightly and turned into a crystal. His skinny cheeks magically became plump at a speed visible to the naked eye. His two arms that were stretched out in the wind became smooth and firm. Just like what he said before, his time was up. So was Ning Ke's time. He had completely understood the Haoran sword qi that youngest uncle had passed to him. He could already control his transformed body and began to greedily and forcefully absorb the aura of heaven and earth that rushed into the room. Then, he turned it into his own power, absorbing the qi of heaven and earth into his body. This was the most obvious and most unacceptable feature of the Devil's Doctrine. After the fresh and inexhaustible aura of heaven and earth entered his body, it was branded by psyche power. Then, it passed through the passage between the snow mountain and the ocean of qi and turned into a majestic power. It passed through the meridians to every part of his body. His arms, muscles, bones, fingertips, and even his hair began to tremble at a high frequency, as if they were jumping for joy because they were powerful. The sole of his foot landed. With a crisp sound, he crushed a white bone in front of him. The second time he landed, his foot had crushed a large pile of white bones. Ning Ke skimmed to the mountain of bones and came to the front of the old monk. He held the knife with both hands and stabbed it into the old monk's chest. The blade of the knife vibrated at a high speed due to the strong power coming from the hilt. It cut and shook the surrounding air, causing wisps of white turbulence. The cold talisman on the surface of the knife was activated, but it was even more terrifying than the speed of the knife itself. This was the fastest attack he had ever made in his life. It was as fast as lightning. This was the strongest attack he had ever made in his life. It was as fast as thunder. The electric knife that carried the Great Spirit did not allow for the blink of an eye or even the time to think before it violently reached the old monk's chest. The sharp tip of the knife pierced into the old monk's chest before he could react. At this moment, Master Lotus was absorbing the qi of heaven and earth nonstop. His cheeks were plump and his arms had recovered. His body was full of vitality, like a newly bloomed lotus. However, he did not expect Ning Ke's first strike to be so overwhelming and unstoppable. At this moment, he had recovered about 10% of his state power from his peak. He was once Lotus 32, who had thousands of incarnations and looked down on the common people. Even if he had only recovered 10% of his power, he would not be killed by such a strike. His skinny ghostly hands had become plump again. His skin was white and smooth, like two pure white lotus flowers. The white lotus flowers bloomed, and its petals bloomed. The blade stopped between the petals and could not go any further into the old monk's heart. At this moment, the aura of heaven and earth that had broken through the confinement was still surging into the old monk's body. He was still growing stronger. Ning Ke groaned, and his left hand slapped the end of the hilt heavily. At this moment, his left hand was like a heavy hammer. The Biyao went further into the old monk's chest. The tip of the blade started to ooze blood. The old monk looked at Ning Ke coldly. A terrifyingly strong psychic power pierced his sense of perception. With a puff, Ning Ke spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood dripped onto the hilt of a knife. His left hand landed on the hilt again. He endured the intense pain, and his left hand turned into a hammer again, hitting the end of the hilt heavily. The blade went another inch deeper into the old monk's chest. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 284. The old monk let out a shrill scream. His hands, which were like white lotuses holding onto the blade, started to tremble rapidly. A substantial force surged up along the blade and collided with the Howren sword that Ning Ke had infused into the blade. There was a loud bang. Dust flew up in the dark devil's hall. The bone mountain collapsed, and the broken bones and bone fragments were like garbage. They were blown around by the strong wind and hit the bluestone walls. The unconscious Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu were also pushed to the corner by the strong impact. The Qi of heaven and earth, which had not appeared for decades, continued to repair Master Lotus's broken body. It helped him to recover his state and strength at a terrifying speed. The first thing that became terrifyingly strong was his mental strength. The Qi of heaven and earth was also absorbed by Ning Ke at the same time. It was then converted into the primordial Qi in his body and finally turned into a powerful force that he had never experienced before. In the end, it was still a competition of time. It all depended on whether Ning Ke could become strong enough to kill his opponent before the old monk recovered. That was why Ning Ke did not use the talisman in the pouch or the primordial 13 arrows. This was because these techniques required the Qi of heaven and earth to reach a certain strength. It also required his psyche power to be completely unaffected by his opponent's mental strength. Under such circumstances, he could only trust the 3 Biyaos behind him. The 3 Biyaos that had killed countless enemies from Min Mountain to the city of Wei and from the city of Wei to the Spring Breeze Pavilion. However, it was a pity that absorbing the Qi of heaven and earth was a technique of the Devil's Doctrine. As a veteran of the Devil's Doctrine, Master Lotus was far more skilled in this technique and state than Ning Quebec. The difference in state between the two of them was too great. Time was not fair. Ning Ke could not kill his opponent with one strike. As time passed slowly and unstoppably, the situation became more and more disadvantageous for him. He could clearly feel that his body was stronger than before. However, the hand that was holding onto the hilt of the Biyao started to tremble weakly. He could barely hold onto the hilt anymore. This was because the power coming from the blade was almost stronger than his. He looked up and saw the cold eyes of the old monk. When their gazes met, it did not produce a destructive effect like when their auras met on the blade. Instead, it was gentle and tranquil, like a drop of dew rolling off a lotus leaf and landing on the surface of a lake, causing ripples. When the ripples spread, it was a new world. Master Lotus' pitiful voice came from the night sky. "This is my world." Ning Ke looked at the billions of stars embedded in the night sky and remained silent. He knew that his sense of perception had finally been invaded by the old monk's terrifying spiritual power once again. He also finally understood that the space 1 foot in front of a truly powerful cultivator was definitely their world. Be it their power or consciousness, everything would be under their control. The night sky suddenly shook. It did not crack, but the billions of stars embedded in it fell. Those stars cut through the sky and smashed into the wilderness in front of him with long tails. The earth groaned and trembled painfully. The winter trees and frost grass were covered by the splashed mud or burned to ashes by the high temperature. He knew what this scene represented. The billions of stars that fell from the night sky were Master Lotus's spiritual power. The moaning and groaning wasteland, grass, and trees were his sea of consciousness. When the wilderness and the grass and trees were turned into a purgatory by the falling stars and turned into scorched earth, his sea of consciousness would be broken, and he would either die or become an ignorant cripple. Ning-Ke stood in the wilderness and looked at the wildfire caused by the falling stars. He looked at the horrifying crater in the wilderness nearby. He did not brush off the black mud on his body, nor did he hide, because he did not know how to avoid it. He had just inherited youngest uncle's legacy and risked being punished by heaven. He saw that he could survive in the midst of death, but he ended up in such a hopeless situation and was about to die. Was this really fate? Was it really Haotian's curse? His heart was cold, and he even felt true despair. However, in the depths of his despair, there was still a strong unwillingness and a strong desire to shatter all these stars. It was as if an existence in the unseen world had sensed his strong unwillingness and desire. An extremely faint shadow slowly spread over his head and covered his entire body. He looked at the shadow in front of him, and his own shadow that was even deeper in the shadow. He suddenly turned around. There was nothing in the wilderness behind him. There was only a statue, a black statue. The statue seemed to be human, but also seemed to be a deity. As its back was facing the light, its face and body were immersed in the deep shadow and could not be seen clearly. The stars in the night sky were still falling. Hundreds of millions of stars kept hitting the wilderness and became denser and denser, gradually annihilating Ning-Ke's body. After the appearance of this black statue, the falling stars were like moths that had seen a flame and were strongly attracted by an invisible force. They all swept toward the black statue. The stars that had caused such a huge commotion earlier were as weak as fireflies when they collided with the huge black statue. Hundreds of millions of stars were a group of weak fireflies. They kept hitting each other and flashed a weak flame. The weak flame was also absorbed by the black statue. The black statue gradually heated up and then turned red, as if it was plated with a layer of blood. It should be very hot, right? Ning-Ke looked at the huge statue in confusion and thought so. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his waist. He looked down and saw that his belt was emitting wisps of green smoke, as if it was about to burn. He did not know what was inside, but it was extremely hot. Ning-Ke returned to the real world. Only then did he realize that the old monk had pushed the blade out a few inches from his chest. The hard hilt was already at his waist, pressing against something in his belt. That thing was so hot that it seemed to be burning. It was maddening. Ning-Ke stared at the old monk's warm but cold eyes. He held the hilt tightly and pushed it forward. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth like a waterfall. He roared in pain, his feet digging deep into the limestone floor like nails. He leaned forward and used the hard object at his waist to hold the hilt of the saber. He put all his weight on it, and the edge of the saber went in another inch. The old monk looked at the blade that was slowly entering his chest, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. His mental strength touched Ning-Ke's body and disappeared instantly, like a clay ox entering the sea. The speed of the loss was shocking. In just a moment, his sense of perception was half empty. Using the devil's skill to absorb the chi of heaven and earth relied on pure psyche power to control it. At this time, the psyche power in his sense of perception was drying up. The chi of heaven and earth in the devil's hall did not enter his body, but floated towards Ning-Ke's body. The old monk could clearly feel that the power from the blade in his hands had suddenly increased. He glared at Ning-Ke, and then looked down at his waist. There was an extremely soft sound of friction. It was like the gentle breeze from a lake brushing across the lotus leaves. The sharp blade cut off a few fingers, and the broken fingers fell slowly. The pure white lotus petals fell off. Ning-Ke let out a muffled groan. The padao in his hand violently pierced forward, accompanied by an unstoppable Haoran sword style. The bright blade pierced into the old monk's chest with a puff, directly piercing through his heart. Chapter 4. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.